Part 14. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 131. As Musian walked onto the arena, many disciples in the audience couldn't help but look at him. Huang Manting also saw this scene, and looked at Musian in surprise. This doesn't seem like his style. In my impression, this young master of the Mu family is the type who would never fight unless he could. Why would he accept the invitation to fight this time? Or did he just want to show his talent to the other leaders? On the other side, Ye Lingxian and Ye Qian also noticed this scene, and couldn't help but look up, with a bit of surprise in their eyes. Why would Brother Mu go on stage to fight with others? Ye Qian's eyes were a bit worried. Although he was willing to believe Musian, the third prince was still a member of the royal family of the Dogon dynasty. Before entering the Lianji sect, he had always had a lot of resources and even skills, and the grades of the two were very close. Ye Qian had never seen Musian take action so far, so it was inevitable that he was a little worried at this time. Ye Lingxuan's expression remained calm. She looked up at the young man on the arena with a smile and said softly, "Don't worry, Brother Mu will definitely go on stage when he is sure. Have you ever seen him do such an unsure thing?" With her sister's comfort, Ye Qian first nodded softly, feeling relieved. Brother Mu. Then, the name that Ye Lingxian had just unconsciously called out flashed through her mind, and she subconsciously turned her head to look at her sister's exquisite and beautiful profile. My sister just called him, Brother Mu. My sister clearly didn't dislike him very much before, and even asked her to be careful to prevent Brother Mu. How could it be? Ye Qian stared at Ye Lingxuan's profile, with a bit of confusion in her eyes. At the same time, Bai Ruoxi also looked up and stared at the figure in front of the arena. The strong wind blew her palace skirt tightly against her snow-white skin, outlining her graceful figure with excellent proportions. The full chest set off by the lapels vaguely revealed a hint of snow-white, unfathomable. At first glance, people have the idea that you have big breasts, so whatever you say is reasonable. Beside Bai Ruoxi, Princess Yongning, who was dressed like an empress, glanced at the woman beside her, smiling, and said, "Sister Ruoxi, are you worried about Mr. Mu?" Bai Ruoxi shook her head slightly and smiled, "He won't do anything he is not sure of." She has never seen Musian do anything impulsive. If he is not sure, he will not accept the invitation of the third prince. Oh! Princess Yongning narrowed her eyes slightly, raised her head and looked at the young man on the arena, with a little more interest in her eyes. This useless brother of hers is at least the 5th level of Qi training, and Musian is obviously not in the realm of spiritual training. Even from the aura he exuded at the time, he should be between the 5th and 7th levels of Qi training. Miss Bai is so sure that Musian can win? At the same time, several chiefs on the high platform also noticed some commotion there, and Yan Ruyu was the first to turn her head to look. When she saw Musian on the martial arts stage, she pursed her elastic lips and glanced at Yuzian, the chief of Daofeng beside her. Musian going on stage to compete, this is not a good thing. At least it is not a good thing for her. If Musian performs too well and attracts the attention of other chiefs, it will be difficult for her to operate. Musian is also on stage. This is really not in line with the character of that disciple. Yi Hao looked at the figure on the martial arts stage not far away and couldn't help laughing. Ever since Musian praised Yi Hao in front of Ling Long that day, he liked the young master of the Mu family who had just joined the sect. If there was only one quota for inner disciples, and there were 3 or 4 genius disciples who had to be fought for among the inner disciples this time, he would even choose Musian without hesitation. The head of Chunyang Peak was quite sturdy, with loose red hair. He looked at the boy on the competition stage and also praised, "I haven't seen him for a few days. He has already reached the 6th level of Qi training from the 5th level, this speed of cultivation is really amazing." Yuzian, the head of Daofeng, stood gracefully, slightly raised her head and looked at the competition stage. She was wearing a feather robe, her face was cold, and she had a kind of holy temperament that people dared not blaspheme. After staring for a moment, she smiled indifferently and said, "It should be that he got some adventure from Senior Linglong these days. Generally speaking, how could it be possible to be promoted to a higher level in just a few days? Even a genius would not be able to do it, but Musian did it." Yi Hao nodded silently, although he smiled, but he never spoke. If you have to say it, Musian did get some adventures from Linglong. And he was the one who gave Musian the adventures. This Musian probably ate the 8 treasure crane, which directly promoted him to a higher grade. Ninglong has taken action, someone around him suddenly said, and then, in front of a certain arena in the distance, the third prince's body burst out with amazing spiritual energy. Judging from the power of this spiritual energy, it has far exceeded the 5th grade of Qi training. Many people in the audience were a little surprised, but some people showed an unexpected look. After all, the third prince grew up in the royal family in the past, so he must have this ability. After all, with the resources of the royal family, even a pig would have become a spirit, let alone a human. It is not impossible to obtain some secret methods to forcibly improve his grade. The third prince raised the tip of the sword in his hand and pointed it at Musian, saying, "Master Mu, the sword has no eyes. If I accidentally hurt you, don't blame me." Musian smiled lightly and said, "The third prince is right, the sword has no eyes, so you have to be prepared." The third prince narrowed his eyes slightly and stared at Musian. He knew that Musian's strength was very close to his, but Musian obviously didn't know that he had a secret method that could forcibly improve his grade. Although there was only 1 stick of incense, it was enough to end the battle within this period of time. This sword can determine the outcome. The third prince took a half step forward, and the violent aura surged like a tide. However, Musian's expression remained unchanged, but he just pressed his thumb on the hilt and pushed it up. The sword was unsheathed a little, flashing a little cold light. The spiritual energy in the cauldron in the body quietly circulated, and the sword was unsheathed the next moment. Clang! The surging spiritual energy gathered at the tip of the sword, and the crisp sound of the sword coming out of the sheath came to the ears. The disciples in the audience even saw only a semicircular arc passing by. And the next moment, the sword in Musian's hand had returned to the scabbard. The body of the third prince stopped in place, motionless. After a while, there was a crisp cracking sound from the sword in his hand. When the blade broke, a piece of iron swept across his face, cutting a bright red blood on his handsome face. Then, the third prince fell straight down, his eyes widened, and it seemed that he was still a little unbelievable before he fainted. One sword defeated the cultivator of the same level. This scene came too quickly, and the visual impact it brought was too strong, making many disciples in the audience a little stunned and didn't react for a long time. Gong Sun Cheng's body stiffened slightly, and subconsciously looked at the cold beauty in the palace skirt in the crowd. Musian's sword reminded him of the bronze sword that Bai Ruoxi had sacrificed. On the high platform, Yan Ruyu narrowed her eyes slightly, secretly looking at the young man whose spiritual energy was almost absorbed by half in an instant. At the same time, the eyes of several chiefs and elders looking at Musian seemed to have a little more thoughtfulness. Musian is now at the 6th level of Qi training. This realm is not high, but if his cultivation talent is really so terrifying, he will be a good seedling if he is well cultivated in the future. Musian's skills are quite interesting. One sword decides the outcome. If he can control this skill in the future, it will probably be a surprising move. Yi Hao looked at Musian in front of the competition stage, and after a moment of silence, he commented with a smile. This sword is indeed amazing, but the spiritual energy in the cauldron is probably absorbed by 60%, if he uses the second sword, I am afraid that he will not be able to bear it, the chief of Huabao Peak said. Yuzian frowned slightly, looked at Musian with doubt, and said, "Why do I feel that the spiritual energy in his cauldron is still so full?" The main cultivation of Daofeng is Tao, and this Tao emphasizes Tao follows nature and follows the laws of nature. This Tao makes them naturally sensitive to spiritual energy, so the head of Daofeng noticed the abnormality almost instantly. It stands to reason that Musian should have been absorbed most of his spiritual energy because of the Lone Star Sword, but why does she feel that his spiritual energy is still so full? Upon hearing this, everyone looked at Yuzian in unison. Yan Ruya glanced at this former senior sister inadvertently and secretly smacked her lips. This senior sister is still as sharp as ever. Yan Ruya smiled lightly and changed the subject. This sword is indeed amazing, but no matter what, the inner disciples that everyone here wants to fight for first are still Bairuoxi and others, right? Whether it is Daofeng, Kang Haifeng or even other main peaks, the goal this time is to prioritize the two cultivators in the refining god realm and Ye Lingxian. And then, it is the little girl from the South Barbarian. After being poured with cold water by Yan Ruyu, the several heads calmed down a lot. While Yan Ruyu looked at this scene, the corners of her mouth inadvertently curled up, and she turned her eyes back to the direction of Musian. It seems that we can't delay any further. If Musian is snatched away in advance, especially by the senior sister from Daofeng, it will be troublesome. On the other side, feeling the gazes of everyone, Musian's expression was still calm, just watching the senior brothers in the sect take the unconscious third prince away indifferently. Of course, he just looked calm. Because of that sword strike just now, even Musian himself was also amazed. That sword strike clearly contained Bairuoxi's Tao. Or rather, it contained the power of Bairuoxi's bronze sword. Musian quietly opened his personal interface and took a look. Name, Musian. Role positioning. Achievements, Natural Furnace, Friend of Villains, Envied Talent, Natural Spirit Body, Fake, Sword Immortal Bodyguard, Fake. Musian noticed a blind spot. If I remember correctly, at the beginning, he only had 3 achievements, but now, he has 5. The Natural Spirit Body should be Ye Lingxuan's physique. What about the Sword Immortal Bodyguard? Bairuoxi's physique. Musian looked at the interface in front of him and had a bold guess in his mind. Could it be that I can get new achievements because of them? If so, it would be understandable why I was able to use part of the power of Bairuoxi's bronze sword just now. As for the 2 characters on the role positioning and the love box covering it, Musian was not very surprised. Because a long time ago, after he had an intimate relationship with Bairuoxi, the word supporting role became like this. Quietly closing the interface, feeling that most of the spiritual energy in the cauldron was gone, Musian looked around at the people in the audience with a faint smile, and was about to leave the stage. At this time, Yayu stepped on the ground and jumped onto the arena in the next moment, staring at Musian and said, "Master Mu, do you dare to compete with me again?" Bairuoxi frowned slightly, looked up at Yayu on the arena, and said coldly, "Master Ye, if you want to fight, I can accompany you to try." Yayu stood on the high platform, staring at Musian, and said, "Master Mu, or do you dare not fight with me?" "Who are you?" Sensing Yayu's gaze, Musian covered his chest with his hand, coughed lightly, his lips were pale, and he raised his eyes slightly, saying, "Master Ye, sooner or later, we will have to decide the winner, but I am afraid that my spiritual energy today is not enough for another fight. Of course, if Master Ye insists on doing so, I will sacrifice my life to accompany you." After Musian finished speaking, he drew his sword again, but his figure seemed to be shaking a little. Yayu frowned and stared at Musian. Just now he felt that Musian still had a lot of spiritual energy, but how could he suddenly become so weak? This guy is clearly acting. Let's see how long you can pretend. Yayu took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, stared at Musian, and said, "Okay, then please teach me, Master Mu." After that, he was about to unsheath the sword in his hand. Enough. At this time, A crisp sound came from the high platform, and the sword that Yayu was about to unsheath suddenly made a clang sound and was forcibly inserted back into the scabbard. Then, a woman wearing a loose black robe and a sexy and charming figure appeared on the arena. Yan Ruyu. Yayu's eyes condensed slightly, and he immediately clasped his fists. Master Yan. The voices in the audience fell silent in an instant, and countless eyes stared at the master of the library on the arena, who was as tempting as a peach. Why did the pavilion master stop me from competing with him? Yayu seemed to be very respectful, but his tone was obviously unwilling. In order to defeat Musian, he had practiced hard for so long, but he finally waited until today, but was stopped again. For Yayu, this was simply a huge torture. Yan Ruyu put her hands behind her back and said lightly, Musian's performance this time is already bright enough, and there is no need for a second competition. Yayu was stunned for a moment, and subconsciously looked up at Yan Ruyu, but heard her say, My library has not recruited an inner disciple for many years. It happens that Musian has a good relationship with me and has excellent talent. From today on, he will be accepted as an inner disciple of the library. There was an uproar in the audience. The first inner disciple selected was Musian. They thought that Bairuoxi and even Wei Mengru would be the first inner disciples to be fought over, but they never thought that Musian would be the first to stand out. The chief seat and even the elders on the high platform all looked over, with some surprise in their eyes. This junior sister hasn't recruited inner disciples for many years, but this time she actually took the initiative to choose an inner disciple? Yihao was stunned for a moment, looking at Yan Ruyu on the arena and the young man standing next to her. Although he felt a little regretful, he couldn't say anything. Originally, Yihao planned that if the chief seat didn't choose Musian as an inner disciple in the end, Musian could continue to be his outer disciple in Kanghai Peak. Of course, he would also give Musian the resources that an inner disciple should have, but he would not have the title of inner disciple. But now, for Musian, it is also a great thing. After all, the resources of the library are not inferior to those of the other 9 peaks. Seeing this, the chief seat and elders present all looked a little tangled, but none of them spoke to stop it. After all, Bairuoxi and the others were still outside, so they naturally wanted to be the first to win over those talented disciples. Therefore, it was not shameless for them to stop Yan Ruyu's choice. Yayu looked at the scene with a look of surprise. He was not the first inner disciple to be selected, but Musian was selected as an inner disciple first. Why? Just because of his sword just now? That was just the blessing brought by the Lone Star Sword's skills. What does it have to do with Musian's own talent? Yayu opened his mouth slightly and wanted to speak several times, but looking at the smiling and attractive pavilion master Yan, he still held back the words in his heart. Even he didn't dare to question Yan Ruyu at this time. He knew very well that he shouldn't do such an offending behavior. Yan Ruyu turned her head and looked at Musian. She was tall, with a smile on her lips, and her black hair was scattered like a waterfall, showing a slightly lazy and messy beauty. The extremely sexy figure is hidden under the loose black robe, and the whole body is full of mature and mysterious charm. What does this sister see in me? Is she greedy for my body? Sensing the tenderness between Yan Ruyu's beautiful eyebrows, Musian couldn't help but complain in his heart. He thought that after the other leaders, there would be people who would choose him. After all, there was a spiritual dragon behind him. But Yan Ruyu obviously didn't know about Linglong. So here comes the question, what does Pavilion Master Yan see in him? Beauty. Musian laughed at himself. Musian, are you willing to become a disciple of the library pavilion? At this time, Yan Ruyu suddenly spoke up. Why does it sound a bit like a wedding vow? Musian clasped his fists respectfully. I am willing to do my best for my senior. I shouted in my heart, Sister Yan, I don't want to work hard anymore. Yan Ruyu nodded slightly and said with a smile, in that case, then come to the library to find me. After saying that, She raised her hand towards Musian's forehead, and a ray of spiritual energy quietly entered Musian's body. Musian took out his sect token. On the front was his name, and on the back, the 7 characters "Inner Disciple of the Library Pavilion" appeared. After doing all this, Yanruyu left. She was worried that if she continued to procrastinate, she would have more nightmares at night. If Musian's sect token has the words "Book Collection Pavilion" on it, he won't be afraid that other leaders will notice his secret and start fighting over it. Especially Yuzian, who is stuck at a certain level of the return to Void Realm like her. Seeing the beauty in black robes leaving the pilgrimage hall, Musian withdrew his gaze and walked off the competition stage. And as Yanruyu spoke first, the elders and leaders of the major peaks also fell from the high platform. Bairuoxi originally planned to come up to find Musian, but she immediately became the favorite among the major peaks. Yalingxian was also favored by these 9 leaders. Even Wei Mengru, who had always maintained a low profile and was in an invisible state, was approached. At the same time, many of the disciples present were approached by senior brothers and sisters from the 9 main peaks, and it seemed that they were trying to win them over as disciples of their own main peaks. This is too complicated, Musian looked at the scene and couldn't help but complain in his heart. In fact, in the initial selection of inner sect disciples from the major peak sects put forward the benefits that their main peak could promise. Until later, a shameless old thief from a certain main peak personally invited the disciple to show his sincerity. As can be imagined, the other main peak leaders followed suit later on, which also led to the selection of inner disciples becoming more and more complicated. Sitting down on a stone chair under the stage, Musian watched the scene leisurely. "Miss Bai, speaking of it, I have a destiny with little friend Mu. If you enter Kanghai Peak, you can continue to live in Tianhe Garden in the future. Or if you have a fancy cave, I can make the decision for you. I will give you the cave." Yi Hao suddenly spoke and took out the trump card that he had been thinking about for the past few days. Miss Bai, who was cold, gentle, and had no bad intentions, had bright eyes and looked at Yi Hao subconsciously. Then she nodded her head reservedly and respectfully and said, "After thinking about it for a while, I still think that Kanghai Peak is more suitable for me." Seeing Yi Hao's operation, the leaders of Chunyang Peak and Ziwimeng Peak watched helplessly as Bairuoxi's sect token was engraved with the identity of Kanghai Peak inner sect disciple. They felt like they had a lemon in their hearts. They were all blaming Yi Hao. "Practice. Shameless old thief. What you are doing is worthy of being the master of a peak." Yi Hao smiled calmly and said, "This is fate. The cause that Mu Xiao and I planted first led to the results today. You must not be jealous or lose your status as the leader." Bairuoxi chose Kanghai Peak, and several people looked at Yalingxian and Wei Mengru, as if waiting for their choice. However, both of them did not speak, but looked at Musian subconsciously. This movement was extremely subtle, but it was clearly seen by these old monsters. Several leaders, and even the elders, looked at Musian, who was sitting leisurely on the chair, and couldn't help but narrowed their eyes slightly. It seemed that no matter how many benefits he said, it was not as effective as Musian's words. This Musian is the fundamental factor that determines which main peak these geniuses choose. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 132. What does it feel like to be stared at by a bunch of old monsters? If it had been before, Musian probably wouldn't have been able to give a decent answer. But at this moment, he noticed the gazes of the leaders and elders, and Musian had no choice but to slightly adjust his sitting posture. He tried his best to maintain his original smile on his face, but he was already a little unable to hold himself tight. These are all old monsters from the Return to Void Realm. If you put it outside, a monk in the Void Realm would stomp his feet a little, and everyone in the world would be frightened. But now, these monks who have returned to the Void Realm are all looking at each other. Even though they hide their auras, there is still an indescribable sense of oppression coming quietly. In fact, if they were just ordinary geniuses, these old monsters wouldn't compete like this at all. But both Ye Lingxian and Wei Mengru are evil-like monsters. One is a monster regardless of his background or talent, while the other has reached the 6th level of God refining at a young age. With such an amazing talent, it's no wonder that people want to accept him as a disciple. After all, in life, in addition to one's own money and power, another important pursuit is fame. Lingxi, the leader present, is not lacking power. Liangyi sect is an extremely terrifying force in Dongzhou, and even the entire Xiangxia world, and the leader and elders with high status in Liangyi sect are naturally not lacking. Right. And the next goal they pursue is fame. In the future, when the disciple leaves the sect and travels abroad, when people see this evil genius, they will naturally want to know who his master is. In addition, these disciples transcending tribulations will attract the attention of many people, which are all manifestations of fame. Even if fame is put aside, in future sect competitions, if their own genius disciples stand out, they will also be able to get some exciting benefits. The selection of inner disciples is so complicated because of the combination of these multiple reasons. Little friend Mu, the master of the library pavilion, and I are fellow disciples and sisters. If someone close to you joins our Dao Peak, we can take care of each other in the future, Dao Peak leader Yuzian said with a smile. Her face is extremely beautiful, and she is somewhat similar to Yan Ruyu, except that the leader of Dao Feng has a cold temperament, while Yan Ruyu is more intellectually beautiful. However, with Xiang Yan's fiery temper, he naturally exposed the true identity of the leader of the peak without mercy. If I remember correctly, you and junior sister Yan have had a bad relationship for a long time. The little girlfriend around Mu Xiao has gone Dao Feng, is it really okay? As if hearing the words little girlfriend, Ye Lingxian lowered her eyebrows slightly and remained silent. Yuzian glanced sideways at Xiang Yan, then looked at Muzian again, with a smile on her face, and said, Dao Feng, follow the Tao, which actually also involves luck. The person next to you, there is something wrong with the maid's luck. When she enters Dao Feng in the future, I will personally find a solution for her. Muzian's eyes moved slightly and he glanced at Wei Mengru subconsciously. Among these first mentioned benefits, he was tempted for the first time. However, at this time, the leader of Huabao Peak smiled and said, I can also find a way to solve the problem of luck in the future, and I can also give you a magic weapon that can transform the weapon spirit. Using it, you can bad luck suppresses it for the time being. Huabao Feng even has such a treasure. Muzian glanced at Wei Mengru subconsciously, but found that the maid's face was expressionless from beginning to end, and she didn't seem to have any intention of being moved. Wei Mengru has no interest in the magic weapon to suppress bad luck. After all, there is no magic weapon, but there is already one to suppress bad luck. Muzian silently looked at the several leaders and elders present. Not all the leaders of the 9 main peaks were here. Some of them also personally invited other disciples. But in the first seat here, about 5 or 6 people have gathered. If he makes a bad choice, he may offend some people. Although with their existence, they should not be so petty, but they still feel a little uncomfortable. This is not easy to handle. I thought that there wouldn't be so many troubles here after becoming an inner disciple, but I didn't expect that all these troubles would be blamed on me. Muzian fell into deep thought for a short time. Ye Lingxian looked at Muzian silently and said nothing. She was wearing a purple dress with fluttering wide sleeves, and her elegant temperament was undoubtedly revealed. Although the eyes looking at Muzian were the same as usual, there seemed to be some emotions hidden in his eyes. And all of this was seen by the leader of Dao Feng. Although Ye Lingxian always calls Muzian Mr. Mu externally, someone like Yuzian can see the slight ambiguity between the two at a glance. This Muzian is really a love interest. Yuzian broke the silence with a slight smile, and said in a soft and pleasant voice, the pilgrimage hall is the holy place for disciples of our sect to date. It is rumored that if you can go on a date here with your lover, you can be together forever. If you go with your relatives or friends, you can also get excellent luck and have a good encounter in the future. This rumor is actually true, but it's just that sincerity is true. Most people don't get the luck from the pilgrimage temple because their feelings for each other are not loyal enough. I can give you a day to relax here. No one will disturb you during this day. Bairuoxi frowned slightly, and seemed unhappy. Wei Mengru glanced at Musian casually, and seeing the slightly frozen face of her young master, her eyebrows could not help but slightly raised, as if gloating. Ye Lingxian turned her head to Yuzian and showed an elegant and light smile, saying, "Is what the first master just said about my sister true?" Yuzian smiled and nodded, saying, "I never lie, especially to my disciples." The tone that was always cold suddenly became much gentler. Then he stretched out his hand to Ye Lingxian. The two held hands together, and in an instant, the sect token hanging on Ye Lingxian's waist lit up a faint light. The back of the sect token was engraved with the name of the inner disciple of Dao Feng. Seeing that Wei Mengru was the last genius left, the chief of Huabao Peak seemed a little anxious. He had prepared for the sect competition for so long. If he had the resources but no disciples, he would have to lie dormant for a long time in the future. So he said immediately, "I have prepared 2 enlightened weapons here. One can suppress bad luck. The second is a peerless sword that can perfectly match certain exercises." Originally, he planned to use one of these 2 enlightened weapons to recruit Musian, but Musian was taken away by Yan Ruya first. As for the other magic weapon, the chief of Huabao Peak aimed at Wei Mengru from the beginning, but the other party didn't seem to like it very much. But she didn't like the weapon that suppressed bad luck, so she didn't care about her young master's weapon? As it turned out, the answer was no. As the head of Huabao Peak finished speaking, Wei Mengru subconsciously glanced at Musian, and then her eyes fell on the black sword in the hands of the head of Huabao Peak. She nodded slightly and said, "Junior likes Huabao Peak more." The head of Huabao Peak smiled with satisfaction and said, "In this case, I will accept you as an inner disciple of Huabao Peak." Wei Mengru did not say anything, but just stared at the black sword in the hands of the head. On the other side, Yuzian received her favorite disciple, and her attention shifted to another thing she cared about. She looked at Musian and smiled. "Young friend, Mu consumed a lot of spiritual energy before. If you go back and recover by yourself, it may take some time. If you don't mind, I can use a secret method to help you recover about 30% of your spiritual energy." Musian naturally did not refuse Yuzian's kindness, and immediately clasped his fists and said, "Thank you, senior." The head of Dao Feng smiled slightly, and then reached out and grabbed Musian's wrist. Under the activation of the secret method, the spiritual energy quickly replenished the spiritual energy loss caused by Musian's use of the Lone Star Sword. While replenishing his spiritual energy, she felt the cauldron in Musian's body and his own physique, and nodded secretly. As expected of a young master of a big family, although it can be felt that his body is a little deficient due to some things in the past, his foundation is very solid. If he concentrates on practicing in the future, he will be a very good seedling. Just as Yuzian was about to retract her white hand after the secret method was activated, she seemed to notice something, froze for a moment, and subconsciously turned her head to look at this young man who looked as gentle as jade. 2 cauldrons. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 133. Yuzian stared silently at this handsome disciple who had just joined the sect, with a bit of relief and a bit of anger in her eyes. I felt relieved because I knew why the junior sister just now took the initiative to recruit inner disciples. What Yan Ruya values is probably not Musian's talent, nor the spiritual dragon behind him. After all, the junior sister may not know that there is a spiritual dragon behind Musian. What that junior sister valued most was probably the other cauldron in Musian. And that indignation was disdain and contempt for Yan Ruya's actions. The road to cultivating immortals is long, and when it comes to the realm of returning to the void, each level is completely different. Especially the third level of returning to the void, it can be said that too many monks are stuck. Many elders in the sect are stuck in the realm of returning to the void, and they have never made any progress all year round. Yan Ruyu and Yuzian are both one of them. Generally speaking, cultivation is to purify the mixed spiritual energy from the outside world into spiritual energy that can be absorbed by the cauldron. When the spiritual energy reaches a certain level, it enters a bottleneck period. If you break through the bottleneck, you can be promoted to a higher level. But the further you go, the harder it will be to improve this level. The bottleneck is like a thin film. Although it can be touched, it can only be touched, but it is difficult to break through the bottleneck. At this time, the role of the natural furnace cauldron becomes obvious. The spiritual energy obtained after practicing dual cultivation with the Tian furnace is likely to be a crucial factor in breaking through to a higher level. Junior sister hasn't changed at all. She's just using these little tricks, and she even has her thoughts set on the disciples. At this moment, Yuzian's heart was filled with disdain for Yan Ruyu. This is Australia. Although there were occasional stories of sect elders and sect disciples becoming immortal Taoist couples in the past, these were the minority after all. What's more, Yan Ruyu's motives are impure, so how can this be done? However, now that the other party is an inner disciple of the library pavilion, if the junior sister really wants to do something, it will be difficult for her to stop it. The only thing he could do was to make Musian be more vigilant to avoid being eaten secretly. However, this level of difficulty is too great after all. Although I don't want to admit it, with Yan Ruyu's classy appearance and peach-like attractive figure, if she even slightly flirts with Musian, let alone Musian, the inner circle of the sect will be which of the disciples can resist. We can only take one step at a time. Yuzian stared at this harmless-looking young man, as gentle as the boy next door. Her eyes flashed slightly, and she was lost in thought. On the other side, after recruiting the inner disciples, Yi Hao turned his head to look at Bairuoxi, put his hands behind his back, and said with a smile, "You come with me to Kanghai Peak first, and meet your senior brothers and sisters first. Senior sisters, secondly, I can give you some gifts that I have prepared." When Bairuoxi heard this, she nodded slightly, looked sideways at Musian, and said, "I'll go to Kanghai Peak first." Musian smiled and nodded. Not only Bairuoxi, but also he himself had to go to the library again. After speaking to Waymengru and others, Musian clasped his fists at the leaders, then turned and left the pilgrimage hall. When he turned to leave, he could clearly feel Yuzian's eyes staring at him, but Musian did not stop and walked straight away. On the way, I happened to see Yayu, who was also recruited as an inner disciple not far away. He seemed to have become an inner disciple of Ziwimeng Peak. As for the first one of the other main peak, an acquaintance of Musian was also selected. Huang Manting. As if aware of Musian's gaze, Huang Manting turned her head slightly and looked at her, winking playfully at Musian and pursed her lips slightly. But Musian just maintained his gentlemanly politeness, nodded slightly, glanced at her elastic and moist lips, and then left the place. Yayu stared at Musian's leaving figure with a strong fighting spirit in his eyes. "Do you have a grudge against that person?" Ning Yuan, the leader of Ziwimeng Peak, looked at the talented young man next to him and asked with a smile. Seeing Yayu's slight nod and a bit of strong hatred in his eyes, Ning Yuan spoke again, "Private fights are not allowed within the sect, but if you invite the other party to a duel and the other party agrees, you can still discuss it." "He won't agree, he's a coward," Yayu said angrily. Ning Yuan raised his eyebrows slightly and said with a smile, if that's the case, then let's defeat him with dignity at the Immortal Ascension Conference in a year's time. Yu was slightly stunned and repeated, Ascension Conference. Good. Ning Yuan put his hands behind his back and said, the Lianji sect holds an Immortal Ascension Conference every year. The top 10 disciples can obtain the enlightenment fruit. After taking it, they can directly break through a level under the God refining. Ascension Conference. Yu quietly clenched his fists, with a strong fighting spirit in his eyes. That's right, what he wants to do now is not to settle accounts with Musian, but to practice. Musian is just an obstacle on his path to immortality. If he crosses it, the sky will be brighter. By then, Lingxian and Qianer should also know who their brother is. And Bai Ruoxi, who gave him a letter of divorce that day, would also let her know. 30 years in Hedong and 30 years in Hexi. Don't bully young people into poverty. Yu tried to calm down his mood. All in all, the top priority now is to practice and find the seal that the teacher mentioned before. Yes, there seemed to be a certain seal in the pilgrimage hall he stepped on. And what is hidden in the seal is a huge fairy fate. Other side. Yuzian watched Musian's figure disappear from the end of the field of vision, then withdrew her gaze, turned to look at the Yes sisters, and said with a smile, you two follow me to Daofeng, I will let Daofeng's senior sister let me tell you something about Daofeng. After saying that, she was about to leave the pilgrimage hall with these two superb sisters. At this time, a voice suddenly came to my ears, Sir, what were you looking at just now? Is there anything else concerning that disciple? Yuzian turned around and saw a woman with the same elegant temperament. There was a red dot between her eyebrows and her face was extremely beautiful. The great elder of Daofeng Zhongfeng. The 9 main peaks, in addition to the main peak, are divided into the middle peak, side peaks and guard peaks, and the 3 small peaks are all managed by an elder. Generally speaking, the first one is the person who coordinates a main peak, and the 3 elders are everyone performs their duties and manages their own small peaks. Yuzian was silent for a moment and then said through a message, Junior Sister Yan has not recruited an inner disciple in the past dozens of years. You are not surprised why she took the initiative to recruit an inner disciple this time, and she did so well. Heart. The 3 female elders looked at each other, and they all saw a trace of doubt and confusion in each other's eyes. I hope the leader can clear up my doubts. Yuzian opened her lips lightly, and a crisp and plain voice came to the ears of the 3 female elders. But that seemingly plain voice suddenly exploded into huge waves in the hearts of the 3 elders. A natural furnace. When they looked up again at the figure that had long since disappeared, there was a different emotion in their eyes than before. At this time, Yuzian's majestic voice came to the ears of the 3 people, you must remember not to attack sect disciples for the sake of cultivation. If this behavior is known to others, you will be nailed to shame in the future. On the pillar. The 3 female elders were all awe-inspiring. They looked at the cold-looking leader and immediately responded. Then, Elder Daofeng suddenly asked, what if Junior Sister Yan does something? Yuzian raised her eyebrows slightly and responded calmly, I will find a time to warn her not to do anything that will disgrace the section. What if they really love each other? After all, even if Yan Ruyu really took action, who would know? Who dares to expose it and offend the master of the library? Yuzian was wearing a feather robe, outlining her plump and seductive sexy figure. She raised her head and stared into the sky. After a moment of silence, she said, let's talk about it then. Isn't this peak leader secretly in love with me? Why was he staring at me just now, when Musian left the pilgrimage hall, feeling the mature and sexy leader's scorching gaze behind him? Musian couldn't help but murmured in his heart. Or is it that she has already noticed the Tiansheng furnace? This is not impossible. If you are an ordinary strong person in the Void Return realm, you may not be aware of the secret about Musian. But Yuzian is different. She is a strong person in the realm of returning to the virtual world, and Dao Fengxiu's Tao is born to be very sensitive to spiritual energy. Maybe he really noticed that there are two cauldrons in his body. As early as when Yuzian suggested replenishing spiritual energy for Yuzian, he already had a faint feeling that something was not right. But it would seem a bit impolite to reject the leader's request directly. In the end, it doesn't matter even if the secret of the Tiansheng furnace is exposed to the leader of Daofeng. After all, he won't lose a piece of meat. At most, if the other party comes to find him in the future, he will lose hundreds of millions of spiritual energy. Thinking about such things, he came to the library unknowingly. Lianji sect has 10 main peaks and 2 major shores. One is the north bank, and the library is located on this north bank. The second is Nanan, where the law enforcement hall is located. After walking into the library, completing the corresponding procedures, and waiting at the door for a while, a disciple led Muzian to the back of the library, and walked along the golden suspension bridge suspended in mid-air for nearly 2 sticks of incense. Over time, the horizons gradually broadened. Here, there is a rather spacious villa. This was the first time that Muzian saw the place where the pavilion master lived. The surrounding environment was quite elegant, the sun was shining brightly, the spring breeze was warm, and all kinds of flowers were blooming in the shale garden. The disciple who led the way turned and left, while Muzian stepped into shale garden and saw the master of the library in the elegant side hall. It seemed that she had changed her clothes after she came back. She was holding a jade slip in her hand and looking at it. She was wearing a light and loose mysterious robe. Her hair was simply pulled up with a jade hairpin, and some hair was hung down to add to the look. A bit of a lazy temperament. And in that loose mysterious robe, you can vaguely see the shocking full breasts at first glance, and under that mysterious robe is a pair of snow-white long legs. Such an alluring figure is the most attractive. The attention and affection of little boys. Not as big as Ruoxi's, but probably not much different, and you can't tell the other person's age from the appearance alone, giving people the impression of a young girl. Muzian quietly withdrew his gaze, cupped his fists and said, "Junior has met Pavilion Master Yan. Come in, there are no outsiders here, so you don't have to be so reserved." Yan Ruyu smiled sweetly, put down the book in her hand, and then asked Muzian to take a seat. She said, "I think you must be a little confused as to why I would recruit you as an inner disciple." It was a little strange, but not too strange, Muzian complained in his heart. He could actually vaguely feel that Yan Ruyu had a good impression of him, and if he wanted to analyze this good impression, it might be that the other party had known the secret of the natural furnace, or that she had known that there was a spirit dragon behind him. Of course, Muzian didn't know what the pavilion master was thinking, and this was just a guess. Junior really doesn't understand. I hope the pavilion master can solve the puzzle. Yan Ruyu stared at Muzian's handsome face, smiling, and shook her head gently, saying, "You will know in the future, but not now." She reached out and took out a jade slip from her wide sleeves and placed it on the table. "I haven't recruited inner disciples for a long time, and I haven't prepared any decent gifts. If you are interested, take this thing and study it." "Pavilion Master, you are joking. It is my great luck to work for you. Gifts are not important." Muzian glanced at the jade slip, his eyes slightly focused, and said, "Second-grade formation." If he didn't know that second-grade formations were extremely rare in the outside world, Muzian would even think that this thing was cabbage. But in fact, even those elders may not have many people who can take out second-grade formations. That is, the other party happened to be the pavilion master of the library, so he could take out such a formation. The formations in this fairy world are extremely complicated, and second-grade formations are even rarer. To be frank, the rarity of second-grade formations is probably no less than that of first-grade skills. This pavilion master Yan is really a wealthy woman. That's true. After all, She has been in Lianji sect for so long, so she must have this foundation, Muzian said respectfully. Thank you Pavilion Master. If you need me in the future, I am willing to work hard for you. You don't have to work hard for me. Yan Ruyu raised her eyebrows slightly, and her voice became much softer. But in the future, maybe there will be a time when I need you. She passed the topic without leaving a trace, and continued, now that you are an inner disciple, the monthly salary and resources given to you by the sect will be many times higher than those of ordinary disciples. In addition, if you are confused about cultivation, you can also come here to find me. Since I have accepted you as an inner disciple of the library pavilion, I will be responsible to the end and solve your doubts. Sister Yan is so nice. Muzian thanked Yan Ruyu respectfully with gratitude in his eyes. Seeing the sincerity and honesty in Muzian's eyes, Yan Ruyu raised her snow-white chin slightly and nodded with satisfaction. Eat one bite at a time. Before cultivating feelings, she didn't want to mention her cultivation here. Besides, this matter needs to be considered carefully. She is not in a hurry here. After all, Muzian is here, and the 3 characters of book collection pavilion have been engraved on the sect token. Can he still run away? Muzian obviously didn't expect that while he was raising fish, he had unknowingly introduced a great white shark into the fish pond, and now the great white shark is thinking about how to eat the fisherman. After chatting for a few words and finishing a cup of tea, Muzian took the 2nd grade formation and found an excuse to get up and leave. After leaving Xiao Le Garden, when they came to the library, a slender purple figure came into view. The sunlight made her face look particularly soft, and her skirt swayed slightly in the wind, revealing a pair of snow-white calves. As if she noticed Muzian's sight, she turned her head slightly and looked over, smiling, Mr. Mew. Muzian walked over with a smile and said, there is no one else here, so don't call me Mr. Mew, it sounds strange. Ya Lingxian hesitated for a moment, opened her cherry lips slightly, and whispered, Brother Mew. That's right, Muzian showed a gentle smile, glanced at her side again, and asked in confusion, where is Qian'er? Master just said that he would expand her meridians, so these 2 days I need to meditate and practice temporarily in Daofeng. Ya Lingxian hesitated for a moment, looked at Muzian's handsome face, and said, Master said that the date in the pilgrimage temple can temporarily obtain the good fortune. Although there is a time limit, it is also beneficial for future practice. When explaining this in a roundabout way, the beautiful girl blushed slightly, raised her eyelids, and stared at Muzian with a pair of moist peach blossom eyes, saying, if you are free tomorrow, let's go to the pilgrimage temple to see the peach blossoms together. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 134. Do you have an appointment tomorrow morning? Seeing that Muzian didn't say anything, Ya Lingxian tilted her head slightly and looked at Muzian in confusion. However, her usual calm expression seemed to have a little more anxiety at this time. After all, no matter how mature Ya Lingxian behaved, she was just a young girl in adolescence, and she would feel a little uneasy about her own initiative to invite someone for a date. There is no appointment tomorrow, but I'm afraid I will have one after I go back. Muzian looked at the beautiful girl, trying to show a gentle smile like a big brother next door, and said, I'll pick you up tomorrow. When he said this, he was inexplicably worried. It stands to reason that for the sake of safety, Ya Lingxuan's invitation should be rejected at this moment. After all, Bai Ruoxi was also at the scene before. After hearing the rumors about the pilgrimage hall from the head of Daofeng, it is definitely impossible to say that she is not interested. After all, when she went to the pilgrimage hall to participate in the selection of inner disciples not long ago, Bai Ruoxi took the initiative to invite her once. This matter must be resolved as soon as possible. Well, Lingxian and I will go tomorrow, Ruoxi will go the day after tomorrow, and Qian'er should finish her retreat the day after tomorrow. If possible, you can try to invite Sister Mengru the day after tomorrow. Even if she refuses, you can get a look of contempt, which is a good deal. A qualified warm man should know how to take into account the feelings of every girl and give them the same warmth. It's a bit tiring, but if it's for them, it's worth it. Why do you look a little unhappy? Ye Lingxian suddenly hesitated. Did I cause you trouble? Musian came back to his senses and smiled. I'm just thinking about what to do tomorrow to make you happy. After all, it's my first time going on a date with someone else. The clever girl rolled her eyes at Musian and expressed her disdain with a huh. What are you talking about? Call me brother. Musian gently pinched Ye Lingxuan's tall nose. Sensing the gazes of many disciples, Ye Lingxian gently pushed his hand away, frowned slightly, and said unhappily, don't do this kind of thing here. Do you mean just go back? Musian found the blind spot. Ye Lingxian glanced at him, feeling helpless about this bad-hearted neighbor brother. The two walked along the suspension bridge paved with golden talismans and returned to the glazed hall unknowingly. Musian sent Ye Lingxian back to the house, looked at the empty hall, thought for a moment, and asked with concern, are you used to resting alone? If you are not used to it, I can stay and accompany you. Sensing the tenderness in Musian's eyes, Ye Lingxian pursed her lips. Her heart was inexplicably excited, but she gently pushed his shoulder and said, no, you go back first. If he stayed here at night, who knows if he would take the opportunity to do something. She was not ready for that. Moreover, if she was intimate with Brother Mu in this villa, she would feel guilty. After all, being here would always remind her of Qian'er. Thinking of the past, she had repeatedly reminded Ye Qian to be careful of Musian, but now she was. Ye Lingxuan's eyes were full of complex colors. In that case, I'll go back first. Remember to have a good rest at night. Cultivation is important, but you must also take care of your body. Musian stared at Ye Lingxian and said softly. Ye Lingxian said reservedly, and Musian stayed in the side hall to chat with Ye Lingxian for a few more words to cultivate feelings, and then said goodbye to Ye Lingxian. When he returned to Tianhe Garden, Musian walked straight into the study, then sat in front of the windowsill and opened his personal interface. On the personal interface, 5 achievements were clearly presented in the field of vision. It's absolutely correct. Lingxuan's natural spirit body and Ruoxi's sword fairy body protection have become my achievements. Musian said to himself. I just don't know what the word pseudo behind these 2 achievements means. I only got part of their physique. Could that be what it means? Musian closed his eyes slightly, and could clearly feel that the spiritual energy around him seemed to be more active than before. He could even control part of the spiritual energy around him and temporarily incorporate it into the cauldron for his own use. This physique is a bit outrageous, Musian exclaimed in his heart. This is like a battle with others. When the spiritual energy is not enough, using the special physique of the natural spirit body, you can force it to return to life again. When fighting at the same level or even above the level, it is simply a strong physique that the protagonist must have. Moreover, the speed of cultivation, even when refining pills, the bonus brought by this natural spirit body is also very high. The sword immortal body protection is even simpler and more brutal. This achievement makes him have a strong affinity for swords by nature, and he can also use part of Ruoxi's bronze sword. It seems that the closer I am to these girls, the more achievements I will get. Musian made such a guess. If so, it just fits his current path of living a life of luxury. Originally, he was thinking of finding a rich woman to eat when he was hungry, and now the achievements on this interface are no different from free gifts. I wonder if I will also unlock achievements if I have a closer relationship with my senior sister in the future. Musian fell into deep thought. And the same thing for Sister Mengru. If they can all achieve success, even if they only get some physical fitness, it will be enough. Musian looked at his personal interface and fell into a brief thought. After a while, he shook his head gently and dispelled these thoughts. In short, the meal should be eaten one bite at a time. The most urgent thing now is to plan the date for tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and even the day after tomorrow. In the next 3 days, he has only one thing to do: date, date, and humming date. Luckily, Chiener is still in retreat, otherwise it would be difficult to deal with tomorrow. After all, it is not realistic to take the two sisters on a date at the same time. Thinking about this, he took out the second grade formation in the ring. Second grade formation, 100 birds chain formation. He opened the jade slip, and in an instant, the formation and text in the jade slip were all incorporated into Musian's mind. The content of the formation is extremely simple, and there is even only a paragraph of text description and the arrangement of a formation. But for some reason, this seemingly simple formation, Musian realized the possibilities it represented, and how many formations it could derive. In general, he felt that he had learned the formation after reading it, but he also felt that he had not learned it at all. Musian felt a little subtle. But he was not discouraged. After all, the formation was different from the skills. This thing could not be rushed. It had to be understood and comprehended slowly. It could not be understood overnight. Pavilion Master Yan also said that if you don't understand, you can go to her. Musian put away the jade slip, stood up and stretched his muscles. Boom! At this time, a faint thunder flashed in the distant sky. Musian looked up and saw that dark clouds were rolling and gathering in a certain direction of Lianji sect, and lightning was surging in the lead-colored clouds, and the rumbling sound was endless. It was the pill tribulation. And the direction of the pill tribulation seemed to be Lianji Peak. Someone is refining pills in Lianji Peak. Musian said to himself. Is it the senior sister or the sect master? Musian quickly retracted his gaze. Rather than thinking about this kind of thing, it would be better to find time to ask directly next time and find out. Ruoxi and Sister Mengru haven't come back yet, but Sister Linglong is still in Tianhe Garden. She also needs to keep in touch with her feelings from time to time. Senior Linling's long legs must be hugged tightly. Musian first spent an hour preparing some food, and then came to Linling's room, knocked on the door gently, and said, Senior Linling, I prepared some snacks for you, can you come in? There was no sound or response in the room. Musian knocked on the door again, and then quietly opened the room. The room was empty, and the silver-haired beauty who usually sat in the room in a daze was not in the room. There were a few words written on the table, I'm hungry, go out for a while. Is this because no one feeds you, so you go out to find food? Musian silently put the steamed meat buns in his hand on the table, and then turned and left the room. Looking up at the sky, he sighed a little lonely. Although Ruoxi and the others will be back soon, it's really boring now. But it's okay, it's just right to take this opportunity to think about how to create a good memory for Lingxian tomorrow. Thinking of this, Musian returned to the study and decided to make some memoranda and confirm the action plan. However, this time, as soon as he opened the study, he saw a paper crane landed on the table. Before, Tianxian City and Lianji sect were some distance apart, but now, the speed of paper cranes to send messages is much more efficient. From the breath, it can be judged that this is the paper crane sent by the senior sister. Finally, you are willing to reply to me. Musian couldn't help but smile, walked to the table and sat down, and looked up at the sky not far away. The robbery cloud in the direction of Lianji Peak just now has disappeared, and it seems that the alchemy has ended. It's just the right opportunity to ask the senior sister if she was refining the alchemy just now. Musian opened the paper crane. Congratulations on becoming an inner disciple. Senior sister Yan rarely takes the initiative to recruit disciples. Since she recruited you as an inner disciple, she probably thinks highly of your talent and strength. Senior sister is really well informed. Musian admired in his heart and continued to read, The road to cultivating immortals is long. Only by guarding against arrogance and impatience can you go further. The elders in the sect, including senior sister Yan, also hate arrogant disciples. Remember this. The tone of voice showed the concern of the senior sister for the junior brother. With the character of that cold and beautiful senior sister, she definitely treated me as her own person. Musian raised his eyebrows slightly, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and continued to read. Speaking of which, I once promised you that if you become an inner disciple, I would give you a reward. Go to the pilgrimage hall tomorrow and give you a gift. Senior sister is really nice, and she also gave you a gift. Musian's indifferent smile froze on his face, looking at the letter in his hand, stunned for a long time. Tomorrow. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 135. This is not easy to deal with. If I go to the pilgrimage temple to find my senior sister tomorrow, what about Sister Lingxian? But if I reject my senior sister now, it will also be very troublesome. Musian looked at the content written on the letter and fell into silence for a long time. Is this senior sister so domineering? Don't give me a chance to refuse. If it were normal, it would be fine, but I have an appointment with Sister Lingxian tomorrow. After pondering for a long time, Musian started to write something on the letter. Since I can't stop and can't refuse my senior sister, I might as well take the initiative. After doing all this, he put away the letter and left the room. Just at this time, I saw a slender figure quietly approaching in the distant sky. The maid was wearing a yellow skirt, and her white jade feet under the skirt were stepping on a pair of embroidered shoes. She landed not far in front of Musian. Sister Mengru. Musian raised his hand and greeted with a smile. Wei Mengru said softly, then looked at the young master in confusion and asked, "Are you going out? Did something happen?" Sister Mengru is really worthy of her name. She can see everything at a glance. Musian praised sincerely. He didn't even say a word, but Wei Mengru immediately noticed that he was worried. Although she looked cold and unkind on weekdays, in fact, this maid still cared about her young master. Wei Mengru was indifferent to Musian's praise, but just stared at Musian silently, waiting for his answer. Sister Lingxian invited me to go to the pilgrimage temple to see the peach blossoms tomorrow, Musian said. Wei Mengru raised her eyebrows slightly, and said with a somewhat sarcastic tone, "For a fickle young master like you, isn't this what you want?" She knew that her young master had been coveting the Ye sisters for a long time, but Ye Lingxian was quite wary of this young master Mu before. This time, Ye Lingxian took the initiative to invite him on a date. Isn't it just what Musian wanted? Musian was silent for a long time, and sighed, but senior sister Lan also invited me just now. Wei Mengru. She immediately glanced at Musian and said lightly, "You deserve it." Sister Mengru, you should help think of a solution at this time, Musian said. I am only responsible for your safety, and other things have nothing to do with me. Wei Mengru added, if they chase you in the future, it is also not within my protection. After all, if Bairuoxi and others chase you, it is Musian's own fault. But with Miss Bai's personality, she probably won't chase Musian. This young master is very smart and always controls himself at a suitable degree. Although he seems to be jumping back and forth on the edge of death every time, he can still jump around every time because he can always grasp the degree. Wei Mengru raised her hand and handed him a black sword, saying lightly, "This is one of the gifts given to me by the chief of Huabao Peak. I already have the weapon, so you can use it. It has been enlightened with the weapon spirit. If you inject spiritual energy into it, it can take you to fly with the sword, but it can only last for 1 hour." Wei Mengru continued to add. There are no fancy patterns on the surface of the black sword, but it looks extremely sharp and shines with a dignified luster in the sun. If such a fairy sword is placed in an auction house outside, it will be priceless. After all, since the establishment of Huabao Peak, there are only more than 20 pieces of magic weapons and weapons that have been enlightened with weapon spirits. This time, the chief of Huabao Peak directly gave away 2 pieces, which is enough to imagine how sincere the other party is. Musian looked at Wei Mengru with some emotion, and took the opportunity to hold the maid's slightly cool white jade hand, saying, "Sister Mengru is so nice." Wei Mengru's face was cold, and she said, "Don't touch me." It would feel better if she bit her lips lightly, then gently grabbed the lapels, and said, Don't touch me with that kind of pitiful and moist eyes." Musian smiled and took the black sword she handed over, saying, "Thank you." Then, he suddenly asked again, "Did the chief say how to solve your luck problem?" Wei Mengru was silent for a moment, and said, "The chief said that he needed to think of a way again, and then discuss it with the chief of Daofeng." Musian looked thoughtful. It seems that Sister Mengru's luck is difficult even for the cultivators in the Return to Void realm. "Are you planning to go out now?" Wei Mengru quickly changed the subject. Musian nodded slightly and smiled, "After all, I miss my senior sister so much now, so I can't wait to find her. As long as I go to find my senior sister now, I won't have to go to the pilgrimage temple tomorrow." Wei Mengru seemed to understand what her young master wanted to do, and immediately cast a contemptuous sidelong glance at him. "Sooner or later, you will regret it?" Musian smiled but said nothing. "Let's talk about it when that day comes." However, the possibility of this is almost zero. He still knows when to communicate closely with whom. If things are delayed until tomorrow, and Ye Lingxian and senior sister Lan bump into each other, it will be a bit tricky. No, it's not tricky anymore, but a situation that is difficult to deal with. After all, Sister Lingxian finally had a better impression of him because of the sect assessment and Linglong's matter, and this time she took the initiative to invite him to see the peach blossoms together. If I run into my senior sister, that would be troublesome. That's why I have to take the initiative. Sometimes there's no need to be so stubborn. Why do I have to wait for death here? On my side, wouldn't it be better if I just took the initiative to go to Lianji Peak? Not only did I express my eagerness to miss my senior sister, but I could also make time tomorrow. A perfect way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. At dusk, Shaoli Garden. Yan Ruyu, who had just finished meditating and was drinking morning tea and reading a book in the side hall, saw a surprising guest. This guest had a beautiful face, wearing a feather robe, charming and gorgeous, but her beautiful eyes revealed the majesty and coldness of a superior, making people dare not easily look up and look at her. "Senior sister Yu, how come you have time to come to my little place?" Yan Ruyu raised her head and asked with a smile. The woman who appeared in the side hall at this moment was Yu Zian, the head of Daofeng, who had a very high status in the entire Lianji sect. As she spoke, she poured a cup of tea for Yu Zian, and then invited her to sit down. "Junior sister, I haven't seen you for a long time. It seems that you are still stuck at the 3rd level of returning to the void, and have never made any progress." Yu Zian drank a sip of tea, her tone was calm, and there was a charming arc at the corner of her mouth. The lazy and noble-looking master of the library fiddled with her hair with her fingertips, glanced at her senior sister who used to be in the same sect, and smiled faintly. "Senior sister, did you come to me just for such a boring thing?" Yu Zian smiled faintly. "The inner disciple you just accepted today, has he gone back? I thought you would be eager to let him stay here and cultivate feelings with you." There seemed to be a hint of sarcasm in the words. Yan Ruyu frowned slightly and said, "What do you want to say, senior sister?" Musian is a natural furnace. The Taoist nun of high status stared at Yan Ruyu with a slightly condensed gaze. Yes, Yan Ruyu was not surprised, but answered in a calm tone. She and Yu Zian both practiced the principles of nature and were naturally quite sensitive to spiritual energy. She could detect the abnormality of Musian, and Yu Zian could naturally do the same. For the sake of cultivation, junior sister didn't even let go of a disciple who had just joined the sect. Yuzian's tone was a bit more like an elder scolding a younger generation. I don't understand what senior sister is talking about at all. Yanryu took a sip of tea and said lightly, I am attracted by Yuzian's talent and I love his talent. Is it not okay? Seeing Yuzian frowning slightly, Yanryu continued, the natural furnace is indeed a tempting existence, but I won't force a junior to do anything. Of course, if he took the initiative to do something, it would be completely different. Yuzian stared at Yanryu's exquisite profile silently, and said, I won't point fingers at your private life, but if you do something that goes against the image of the sect dash. Yanryu interrupted with a chuckle, how about giving that disciple to senior sister? Yuzian frowned slightly and said, I disdain to use this method to upgrade the grade. In that case, don't disturb me teaching my disciples. Yanryu's fingertips gently stroked the tender and silky thighs under the black robe, raised her eyes slightly, and said with a little smile. Besides, senior sister, do you think we can't become a good story, or do you think that my charm can't attract a little boy? Originally, the head of the library was still considering whether it would be bad to do such a thing. After all, the disciple looked like a very simple big boy. It would not be good if he was left with some psychological trauma because of her coveting. But now hearing Yuzian teaching her in that tone, Yanryu naturally got angry and did whatever she could to anger senior sister. Sister, if you came to me today just to talk about this, you can go back. Yanryu smiled and said, I know how to teach my disciples. Yuzian was silent for a moment, and suddenly smiled and said, you don't care, but now the three elders of Daofeng all know Yuzian's secret. If other people in the sect know about this, I'm afraid that Pavilion Master Yan will be despised by others in Lianji sect in the future. Yanryu sneered on the spot when she heard it, sister, you like to do these little tricks. Yuzian only discovered the secret of Yuzian afterwards, otherwise she would have snatched this disciple away in advance. In the final analysis, if most of the female elders in the sect knew the secret of Tianzhengluding, they would probably extend an olive branch to Yuzian without hesitation. Is this sister really so clean that she can face the opportunity to break through the bottleneck without wavering? If there is nothing else, please go back. Yanryu spoke lightly, and also announced that this topic was over. Looking at the beautiful back of the Taoist nun, Yanryu's mouth curled up slightly, and she was in a very happy mood. She was naturally aware of the dangers that Yuzian mentioned. What to do, she knew it in her heart. Lianji Peak. Yuzian flew to Lianji Peak on a sword, and then threw the paper crane he had already written into Lianji Peak. After waiting outside for a while, he saw the cold beauty in a fluttering white dress coming into view. This dress is different from the past. Although it is also a white dress, it can better highlight the exquisite and protruding figure of this cold beauty. Senior sister Yuzian looked at Lan Murian with a bit of longing in his eyes. Lan Murian gazed at Yuzian, her eyes lingering on the black sword at his feet for a moment, and said, why are you here now? I have been too busy these days and have not been able to see my senior sister. Just now, after the inner disciple selection was over, I saw my senior sister's paper crane and couldn't help it. Yuzian hesitated and said, will it not cause trouble to my senior sister? If my senior sister has something to do, I will go back first, and we can go to the pilgrimage temple together tomorrow. Lan Murian shook his head gently and smiled, come with me. After that, he took Yuzian to the courtyard in the back mountain. After pouring a cup of tea for Yuzian, Lan Murian smiled lightly, congratulations, you are the first one to be favored by senior sister Yan. Yuzian sighed, to be honest, I was a little surprised. I thought there was no hope, but I didn't expect that Pavilion Master Yan would favor me and choose me. Senior sister Yan and the head of Daofeng are from the same school. They both practice the principles of nature. They are naturally very friendly to spiritual energy. I think she discovered your talent. When Lan Murian said this, she frowned slightly and continued. But you still have to be careful. If your physique is exposed, it will cause great trouble. No, she shook her head gently and said, maybe senior sister Yan has already known the secret of you, so she chose you. What does great trouble mean? Dual cultivation? If that's the case, it's not a big trouble. Musian drank a sip of tea silently and said, senior sister is right, I will be careful. Lan Murian stopped struggling and continued to ask, you will have a lot of salary and resources every month in the future. If you use them for cultivation, it will not be difficult to enter the soul refining within half a year. I promised you that if you become an inner disciple, I will give you a gift. Since you are here today, I will give it to you now. After saying that, Lan Murian opened his palm, and a small box with exquisite workmanship appeared in his sight. Musian took the box and opened it. A strong medicinal fragrance floated into his nose, refreshing his heart. Is this, Jinpin Dan? Musian looked up at the beautiful lady in a white dress who was wearing a gorgeous long skirt and had a noble and cold appearance. Take it, you deserve it. Lan Murian's beautiful eyebrows revealed indifference. Musian quietly put away the Jinpin pill, and couldn't help sighing again in his heart, senior sister is really a rich and powerful sister. When he was in the Mu family, he heard from the elders in the clan that the refining of pills like Jinpin pill, which can directly upgrade the grade, is quite troublesome, and the medicinal materials required are also extremely rare, not as easy as Lan Murian said. Is senior sister still at the peak of refining spirit? Musian asked. Lan Murian nodded slightly, not entangled in this topic, and said, you have senior Linglong behind you now, and no one will hold on to Miss Bai's demonic aura. I have also reported this to Master. Senior Linglong is indifferent by nature, and he may leave at any time. Don't offend too many people in the section, she reminded. I have never taken the initiative to provoke anyone, but they have always come to provoke me, Musian said helplessly. After finishing a cup of tea, Musian suddenly asked, can I come to Lianji Peak later? Lan Murian nodded modestly, if I have time, yes. Senior sister is indeed cold on the outside, but actually very gentle at heart, Musian understood, and after chatting for a few more words, he left Lianji Peak smoothly. But he did not return directly to Tianhe Garden, but went to Daofeng. The chief monk just came back and is now in seclusion, not seeing anyone outside the main hall of Daofeng. A female disciple stopped him. Are there two female disciples coming to Daofeng today, one wearing a purple skirt and the other wearing a blue logo skirt? Are they a pair of sisters? Musian asked. Seeing the female disciple nod slightly, with doubt in her eyes, Musian continued, I am Chiener and Lingxuan's brother. This time I came to see the senior for an important matter. Please pass it on. The female disciple looked at Musian with doubt, then nodded, turned and walked into the hall, and saw the beautiful woman in feather robes sitting in front of the throne. Master, there is a disciple outside who claims to be Ye Lingxian and Ye Qian's brother asking to see you. The female disciple clasped her fists respectfully. Yuzian, who had just returned to Daofeng, quietly opened her eyes, hesitated for a moment, and then looked up outside the hall. Soon, a very beautiful and moving smile appeared on the face of Daofeng's master. Please let him in. Warm Ti. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 136. Daofeng, Dexin Hall. Musian walked into the magnificent hall, and under the guidance of a disciple, he came to a simply decorated hall behind the hall and met the head of Daofeng. The room was warm as spring, and sandalwood was lit in the hall. Yuzian, dressed in gorgeous clothes, sat at the table, and had already set out tea and snacks, waiting for someone to come with a smile. The head of Daofeng looked to be about 27 or 28 years old, not in the prime of life, but he had the most plump and sexy body of a woman, and his feather robe showed a very attractive figure. There are indeed many benefits to cultivating immortals. At least now, you can't tell the other person's age at all. The masters of the Return to Void realm are indeed unfathomable. Muzian quickly retracted his gaze and clasped his fists, saying, "Hello, senior." Muzian raised her eyelids, her eyes seemed to be rippling with watery light, motioning Muzian to take a seat, and then asked, "Are you used to the library? If you are not used to it, you can also come to Daofeng to find me in the future." "Why is he openly poaching?" Muzian said respectfully. "Master Yan is very caring to me, and I have no plans to leave for the time being. After all, the 7 characters of Inner Disciple of the Library have been engraved on the sect token, and it is clear that it is not realistic to want to leave the library. What's more, Yan Ruya just gave him a 2nd grade formation not long ago. Muzian is a grateful person, so it is impossible for him to run away because of a few words." Muzian was not surprised. She drank a sip of tea and said with a gentle smile, "What do you want to ask me?" Muzian nodded slightly and said, "Junior wants to ask about my maid." Muzian gently stroked the rim of the teacup with her fingertips and said, "Are you referring to her luck?" Seeing Muzian nodded slightly, Muzian smiled and said, "The head of Huabao Peak has come to me about this matter not long ago. Your maid's luck doesn't seem to be innate." Muzian was a little surprised and raised his head and said, "Can luck be worsened later?" Since Senior Ling Long can inherit luck, he naturally has some secret techniques to make people's luck worse to the extreme, Muzian said. "Senior, do you know how to crack this method?" Muzian asked humbly. The beautiful Taoist nun shook her head gently and said, "I've only heard of ways to make people's luck go bad, but I've never seen it." Looking at the boy who seemed a little disappointed, Muzian smiled again, "If you care about your maid, I can investigate this matter for you. With Muzian's current value, it's worth it for her to do so. After all, there is a spirit dragon standing behind him, and his own talent and even the natural furnace, there are reasons to do so." Muzian's eyes bloomed with a hint of surprise, and he said, "Thank you, Senior, no matter what you ask in the future, I will do my best." Muzian looked at Muzian deeply, and a faint smile appeared on her face. "You can leave first. I will have someone investigate this matter. If there is any news, I will inform you in the future." Muzian stood up and was about to say goodbye and leave. Before leaving, he seemed to remember something and suddenly turned around and asked, "By the way, Senior, do many disciples of the pilgrimage temple go on dates on weekdays?" Muzian shook her head gently, "Not many. On weekdays, most of the disciples of the sect are practicing or going down the mountain to perform certain tasks within the section." Muzian was relieved a little and nodded, "Junior will not disturb your meditation and practice. Goodbye first." There were not many disciples at the pilgrimage temple, which meant that there was no need to worry about the date spreading to other people's ears. He didn't need to do anything now, just enjoy tomorrow's date with peace of mind. After saying goodbye to the head of Daofeng, Muzian did not return directly, but went to Kanghai Peak again, waited in front of the hall for a while, and finally saw Bairu Oxi, who had been called for a long time. She was wearing a clean white dress, with a full and straight chest, and walked out of the hall with exquisite embroidered shoes on the ground, revealing a cool temperament. When she saw Muzian, there was a hint of surprise in the girl's eyes, and a faint smile appeared on her face. She came in front of him, looked up at him, and said, "Why are you here?" The originally cool temperament seemed to have a bit more weakness. Muzian stared into Bairu Oxi's eyes and said, "I just want to pick you up, is it not okay?" Bairu Oxi showed a shy look, nodded gently and said, "Of course." As he said that, he looked at the black sword under Muzian's feet with doubtful eyes and said, "What is this?" "Sister Mengro gave it to me not long ago. It can fly freely within an hour." Muzian smiled. Then, Noticing that many disciples around were looking here, especially when they looked at him, their eyes seemed to be hostile. Musian continued, "Let's go back first." Bairuoxi said and then summoned the flying sword. At this time, she felt someone suddenly hug her waist gently, and she turned her head to look at Musian faintly, with helplessness in her eyes. Musian explained, "The flying time of the black sword is almost over. You don't want your Taoist partner to fall off a cliff when you are halfway through the flight, right?" The reason is quite serious, but Bairuoxi deeply doubted Musian's fundamental purpose, but feeling the boy's chest gently against her back, she stopped talking, and tacitly agreed to Musian's actions. The flying sword flew towards the glazed palace. Musian enjoyed the beauty of the beauty in his arms and felt the greatness of her heart. "I have to say, it's really too big." Even though he had confirmed it more than once, Musian couldn't help but sigh in his heart. "By the way, do you know what your physique is?" Musian suddenly asked casually. Bairuoxi shook his head gently, "I don't know. Why do you suddenly ask this? When you use the sword, do you feel that it is much more handy than other weapons?" Musian changed the question. Bairuoxi glanced at the young man behind him in surprise and said, "How did Mu Lang know?" While speaking, she gently slapped his hands away, and her pretty face was covered with a faint blush. Although no one would see it in mid-air, how could anyone be so intimate outside? I guessed Musian didn't care and hugged Bairuoxi's waist again. He was a little thoughtful. It seems that Ruoxi is really protected by a sword fairy. One is protected by a sword fairy, the other is born with a spirit body. I don't know what kind of physique Sister Mengru and Senior Sister Lan have, Musian couldn't help thinking in his heart. Wei Mengru's cultivation speed is so monstrous. Musian doesn't believe that she doesn't have any special physique. Maybe she is just like him, and is also envious of talents. Because her cultivation talent is too monstrous, she has such bad luck. Not to mention Senior Sister Lan, she is a super perfect beauty. She is talented and hard-working. She treats juniors well. She has a cold personality and is a bit like a domineering female president. I just don't know if she is also a domineering female president in bed. By the way, Ruoxi, let's go to the pilgrimage temple to see the peach blossoms together the day after tomorrow, Musian suddenly said. Bairuoxi murmured, "The day after tomorrow." Warm tips: if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. She sat on the flying sword and turned her head slightly to look at Musian. Because of some small movements of Musian on the road just now, her eyes became more moist. She said softly, "Will it not cause you trouble? I thought Mu Lang had invited others." Musian: "How could it be? I only have eyes for you now." Ruoxi Musian also sat on the flying sword, turned his head to stare at Bairuoxi's eyes, and felt the cold touch of the heart lock that quietly fell on his wrist at some point, and sweat dripped down his back. It was close. I almost said the wrong thing. Ruoxi's love lock is too scary. You can't lie in front of her. And she even locked it last night. Although it's romantic to play with it occasionally, it's not fun to wake up one morning and find that you are bound by this thing. But fortunately, this girl is gentle and only feels sorry for Mu Lang. She won't do this under normal circumstances. Musian looked at Bairuoxi's almost flawless beautiful profile, and unknowingly returned to Tianhe Garden with her. "By the way, what gift did Senior Yihao give you?" Musian suddenly asked curiously. Bairuoxi spread out his palm, and an ancient formation appeared on the sect token. He said, "Master said that if there is a cave heaven you like in the future, you can use the formation on this token to exchange for one of the cave heavens." Then, he took out a jade slip from the ring. "Second grade skills," Musian said in surprise. Bairuoxi smiled and nodded, saying, "Originally, the senior was going to give me an 8 treasure crane, but he couldn't summon it back no matter how hard he tried, and I told him that I had drunk the soup of the 8 treasure crane before, so he changed the gift. So that's how it is, Senior Yihao is really generous, Musian said with a smile. For these talented disciples, the major masters are really willing to spend a lot of money. Mulang, I want to go back and see the content of this technique, let's go back to the room together. Bairuoxi looked up at him, the white palace skirt was close to her body, outlining the perfect body proportions, seemingly fragile, but Musian knew that she was not as weak as he imagined, and her figure was also the kind of sexy beauty in the gym, not soft. You go back first, I'll find you later. When Bairuoxi heard this, a trace of disappointment appeared in her eyes. She lowered her eyes slightly and said unwillingly, okay. Looking at this scene, Musian couldn't help but gently kiss the soft lips of the cold beauty and taste the rouge on her lips. Well. Bairuoxi gently pushed Musian, but as soon as her little hand gently pushed his chest, one of her slender hands was held by Musian, and her body gradually softened in his arms. After a long time, she said in a slightly charming and cold voice, it's really annoying. Musian just smiled at this, because he knew that the annoying said by the beauty in his arms was just a simple act of coquetry. After sending Bairuoxi back to the room to practice, Musian first held the back of his head with both hands, glanced left and right, and when he confirmed that Bairuoxi was meditating and studying the second-grade skills he had just obtained, he left Tianhe Garden and went to the villa where Ye Lingxian lived again. After all, Qian'er is still in seclusion, and he is a little worried that Lingxian will be lonely. He must take this opportunity to give her some comfort. The glazed palace is located in front of a villa. Ye Lingxian was sitting in the study and lit a candle on the table. The candlelight illuminated the darkness and also made the girl's pretty face look particularly soft. She was holding a book in her hand and reading quietly. At this time, the candlelight suddenly flickered. Ye Lingxian did not turn her head, but just put down the book lightly and said lightly, "What are you doing here?" In the quiet study, a figure twisted slightly and quietly appeared in the study, saying respectfully, "Miss, the master asked me to take you back." In the darkness, a young man wearing a black robe and looking a little handsome appeared at some point. His eyes were always fixed on Ye Lingxian's back, with respect in his eyes, and a little admiration hidden in his eyes. "There is still half a year, why are you so anxious to come here?" Ye Lingxian said coldly, "Didn't my father ask you to come?" When she said the last word, her eyes fell directly on the old man in the corner. There is a restricted area in Dongzhou. It is said that anyone who enters the restricted area will be cursed and will die suddenly within a few days. There is a kind of reincarnation water in the restricted area. Drinking it can prolong life. If 1 or 2 drops are dropped on some withered medicinal herbs, they can be directly resurrected. The owner of the restricted area in the rumor is Ye Lingxian's father. The reason why the dragon beard given by Musian before reacted to Ye Lingxian was, firstly, because of Ye Lingxian's physique, and secondly, it was related to the reincarnation water that Ye Lingxian used to bathe in. In the past, 1 or 2 drops of reincarnation water in the outside world were sold at a sky-high price, but that reincarnation water was just the bath water that Ye Lingxian used to bathe in since she was a child. If people knew about this, many people would probably be shocked. "Miss is just wasting time here now, so I dare to ask the elder to take Miss back to our clan in advance to prepare for the awakening ceremony in half a year," the young man replied respectfully. "Whether or not I waste time is up to me. I will return on my own in half a year. Mr. Shen, please take Zhoukang back." Ye Lingxian stared at the old man in the corner calmly. The old man called Mr. Shen was silent for a moment and said, "I obey your order." However, Zhoukang seemed a little unconvinced. He stared at Ye Lingxian's back and said, "Miss, you are reluctant to leave the sect, but for Ye Yu." He had heard the elders in the restricted area mention that Ye Yu of the Ye family was a young genius. Ye Lingxian grew up in the Ye family since she was a child, so it is inevitable that she would have some feelings for him. This time, she was reluctant to leave the sect, and it might be related to this person. Who knew that Ye Lingxian just said lightly, "It has nothing to do with brother Ye Yu." The tone sounded like he was talking about a stranger, which made Zhou Kang and Mr. Shen stunned for a moment. Then, Zhou Kang quickly said, "If that's the case, why is the young lady so reluctant to leave? Is it because of Miss Jian'er? Young lady can take her back to the restricted area. Our clan will certainly take good care of your sister." Ye Lingxian was silent for a moment and was about to speak. At this moment, she suddenly seemed to have a feeling and subconsciously glanced in a certain direction outside the window sill. Why did he come here again at night? Ye Lingxuan's eyes condensed slightly, and there was a little more helplessness in her eyes. Zhou Kang looked at the girl who was extremely cold just now and softened her eyes a little. He looked up at the boy who was walking into the villa outside the window sill, and couldn't help but narrow his eyes slightly. It seems that the real reason why the young lady didn't want to leave the sect was not because of Ye Yu, nor because of Ye Qian. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 137. Muzian walked into the villa and walked along the path in the hazy night towards the house where Ye Lingxian usually rested. However, the girl was not seen in front of the window sill. Strange, where did a Lingxian girl my age go? Ye Lingxian probably didn't go to bed so early on weekdays. He had already planned to comfort the lonely and helpless sister Lingxian tonight. As a result, no one was found. Muzian walked along the corridor of the house, intending to take a look in the study. At the same time, in the study room lit by candlelight, Zhou Kang looked at Ye Lingxuan's back and wondered, could the reason why the young lady refuses to leave has something to do with him? Tuk tuk. Ye Lingxian tapped the table gently with her green fingers, and said in a calm tone, "He is the eldest young master of the Mu family. He took good care of me and Jian'er during the sex assessment." Zhou Kang frowned inadvertently and said, "Even so, it is a bit inappropriate for a member of the opposite sex to come to the villa where the young lady lives late at night." A smile appeared on Ye Lingxuan's indifferent face. He came to see Jian'er. Mr. Mu had taken the initiative to pursue her when he was in Tianqian City, and now the two have a very good relationship. Zhou Kang raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "But isn't Miss Jian'er still in Daofeng and not back?" "Brother Mu, can't it be wrong for Master Mu not to know about this?" Ye Lingxian said calmly. Zhou Kang frowned slightly, feeling that something was not right. He even had a bold guess in his mind, but he thought it was a bit unlikely. After all, the lady's personality is not like the kind of girl who would fall in love with others casually. When he was in the clan, he often heard people mention the name Ye Yu. It was said that he was also a young genius in Tianqian City. Although he fell for a while, his talent has recovered and he has become stronger in cultivation. Talent is a very powerful enemy. On the contrary, he had never heard of the name Muzian. In the past, Muzian was just a little-known good-for-nothing young man who was addicted to Nazi every day. If he hadn't awakened his memory, he might not have been found by now. No wonder Zhou Kang didn't know about this person. "Do you doubt what I said?" Ye Lingxian turned her head slightly and glanced at the two people behind her. "I don't dare," the two men replied immediately. Ye Lingxian nodded with satisfaction and was about to ask the two of them to leave. At this moment, a young man's voice suddenly came from outside the study, "Sister Lingxian, why are you still in the study so late?" Ye Lingxuan's body stiffened slightly, and she noticed two eyes looking at her from behind. She sighed helplessly in her heart. She looked up and saw a handsome young man standing in front of the window sill, wearing a luxurious robe. He had the same gentle smile on his face as usual, like the brother next door, and he was raising his hand to wave to her. Then, he walked along the corridor towards the study. Ye Lingxian glanced at the two people behind him casually and said calmly, "You all should step back." You are not allowed to enter this villa again without my order. Zhou Kang frowned slightly and said, Miss, isn't it a little bad to let someone of the opposite sex come in so late? Before he finished speaking, the old man behind him slowly said, in that case, I won't disturb the lady for now. Zhou Kang was silent for a moment and then said, well, I believe that the young lady has her own sense of propriety. She will be blinded by love now just because she has seen too few things. When she experiences more. When you have more experience, you will find that Brother Mu is really good, Ya Lingxian asked with a smile, too lazy to hide it. Zhou Kang choked and didn't know what to say for a moment. Before he came, he planned to give Yayu a little warning, but he didn't expect that the person he would face in the end was not Yayu, but a boy whose name he had never heard of. Apart from being a little handsome, this Musian doesn't have any advantages at all, right? Zhou Kang was about to speak when an old hand pressed on his shoulder. The old man shook his head slowly, indicating that he should keep quiet. Then at the next moment, he left the villa with this young man who seemed to have been somewhat shocked. Not long after, Musian walked into the study and saw the girl sitting quietly in front of the desk. Probably because of the night, her long hair was hanging unadorned on her back, her figure was slender and graceful, and her back alone gave people unlimited reverie. Ya Lingxian turned around and looked over, smiling and saying, what are you doing here so late? Musian looked around, then quietly withdrew his gaze, walked to Ya Lingxuan's side, sat down on the wooden chair beside him, and said softly. You were always with Jianer before, but she's been away these 2 days, and I'm a little worried about you. Ya Lingxian smiled and said, I'm not a child. Are you a little too worried? You should still worry about it? Musian said and leaned forward slightly. Ya Lingxian just looked at him with a smile. When she saw this handsome face almost completely close to her pretty face, there was finally a trace of panic in the indifferent eyes just now, and her lips were rosy. Opening slightly, he said softly. Do, what? Musian didn't speak, but brought his lips to Ya Lingxuan's ear and whispered, did someone come here just now? A trace of surprise flashed across Ya Lingxuan's eyes, and the mood that was originally mixed with a little shame gradually calmed down. She raised her head and looked at Musian, her eyes full of surprise. Musian still looked at her with a smile on his face and stared into her eyes. The moment he stepped into the study, he noticed an aura that did not belong to Ya Lingxian. In the past, Musian might not have been able to detect it, but now Musian is a natural spirit. Even if he is not a true natural spirit, he is still very sensitive to the spiritual energy around him. Under Musian's gaze, Ya Lingxian nodded silently and said, my family sent someone to pick me up, but I told them that I would go back by myself in half a year. Who is your family? Musian asked curiously. Ya Lingxian was silent for a moment, looked into Musian's dark eyes, and said, can you not say it? There was a hint of solicitation in his tone, which was in sharp contrast to the coldness with which he ordered his subordinates before. If Musian knew now, she would be a little worried that the other party would be tempted to quit because of the power behind her, or that her future relationship would deteriorate. Of course, this is because Ya Lingxian does not know Musian's LSP nature. As long as you are beautiful, there will be no intention of quitting. Musian smiled and said, that's fine, tell me when you want to say it. They went back, Musian asked again. Ya Lingxian nodded slightly and said, I'm going back for the time being. When she said this, she frowned slightly, obviously dissatisfied with the two people disturbing her sect life for no reason this time. I will let them go back in the next 2 days, she said again, with an unmistakable coldness in her tone. Musian looked at her cold face and couldn't help but joked, Sister Lingxian is so domineering. Ya Lingxian gave Musian an angry look and said softly, don't make fun of me. I'm in a bad mood right now. Then let's feel better, Musian said. How can it be possible that it will get better just because it gets better? Ya Lingxian muttered. Since you will be depressed because of one or two irrelevant people, why can't you be happy because of another person? Musian looked into her eyes and smiled. I came here to see you because I was worried about you late at night. Wouldn't you like to be happy? Ya Lingxian was stunned, thinking over and over in his mind what Musian had just said, looking at him in a daze. At this time, Musian took advantage of the situation and boldly took Ya Lingxuan's little hand. Are you a little happier now? Musian held her little hand and asked softly. The candle light in the study room flickered, illuminating Ya Lingxuan's eyes particularly brightly and movingly. It took a long time for the girl to wake up from her sudden daze. There was a faint blush on her face, maybe it was reflected by the candle light or something. She let Musian hold her hand, looked at him with her smart eyes, and asked softly, Brother Mu, will you blame me for hiding everything from you? Musian held Ya Lingxuan's little hand tightly, feeling the cool touch and smooth jade-like hand coming from her little hand, and said with a smile, no matter what you do, I believe in you. Ya Lingxian raised her eyes, which seemed to be filled with mist, and looked at him vaguely. Then, she suddenly thought of something and subconsciously wanted to take her hand out of Musian's palm. But Musian refused to let go, holding her little hand tightly and refusing to let go. Don't be like this, I can't be sorry to Qian'er. Before he finished speaking, Musian stretched out his other hand and put his index finger on her lips. Everyone will understand each other in the future, don't talk about this now. After all, there are only two of you and me here, right? Ya Lingxian lowered her eyes slightly, seemingly acquiescing to Musian's words and letting him hold her little hand. After an unknown amount of time, Musian saw that the sky was almost dark, so he said goodbye. Ya Lingxian did not stop him from leaving, but stood in front of the windowsill and watched Musian's figure disappear into the night. The originally heavy mood seemed to relax a little, and the corners of his mouth drew a slight arc. The same thing is said, since you will be unhappy because of certain things, why can't you be happy because of the arrival of someone? Other side. After the selection of inner disciples, each of the 9 main peaks chose their favorite disciples. That night, the 9 leaders gathered together and talked about the selection of inner disciples and some future matters. Junior sister Yan is quite interesting. She has never taken the initiative to recruit an inner disciple before, but she is the first one to choose one this time. Ning Yuan, the leader of Ziwimeng Peak, played with a wine glass in his hand and said with a smile. He spoke. The leader of Tianji Peak was dressed in a black robe. Her face was extremely beautiful, with a faint smile on her face, exuding a mysterious aura. Her graceful figure exuded a mature charm, and she said with a slight smile. Then what's the name of the disciple? I've seen it before. He seems to be at the 6th level of Qi training. His talent is pretty good, but he may have been neglected for a while in the past, and now he can't be called a top genius. Musian, I heard junior sister Lan say before that he performed well in the sect assessment at Kanghai Peak and seems to have some unique understanding of the battle method, the leader on the side said with a smile. As for Kanghai Feng, senior brother Yi seemed to be monitoring him at that time, right? How was Musian's performance? Ning Yuan asked, looking sideways at Yi Hao with a smile on his face. Yi Hao seemed a little absent-minded today and did not speak. After a while, he came back to his senses and said with a smile, well, the performance is not bad, quite satisfactory. When he said this, he looked at Yuzian and Xiangyan inconspicuously, and then looked at the head of Huabao Peak. Regarding the matter of Linglong, except for the 4 heads of the group, no one else knew about it. Now the selection of inner disciples has ended, but the great value behind Musian still exists. If too many people know about Linglong, their advantage will be gone. If they can have a good relationship with Musian and have the opportunity to contact senior Linglong in the future, it will be of great benefit to their future practice. Such an opportunity must be firmly grasped in their own hands. Brother Yi doesn't look very good today. What happened? Yuzian suddenly asked with a smile, changing the subject. Yihao was silent for a moment, and sighed, I spent a long time raising the 8 treasure crane before, but I didn't see any today, I don't know who stole it. Oh. The heads looked at each other and became interested. In Lianji sect, is there anyone who dares to touch Yihao's precious 8 treasure crane? Brother, have you ever tried to use the tracking secret technique? I used the secret technique to try to find the location of the 8 treasure crane, but I didn't find it. Yihao shook his head. It seems that the other party should be well prepared. Yuzian narrowed her eyes slightly, turned her head to look at the head of Tianji Peak, and smiled, why don't you let senior sister you deduce it for you? Yihao thought it made sense and was about to speak. At this time, Ning Yuan suddenly said, look at that, is it the 8 treasure crane? The head of Ziwimeng Peak, who has great power in Lianji sect, looked at the sky in a daze, and his tone was full of surprise. All the heads looked up and saw a silver-white 5-clawed silver dragon appearing in their field of vision. It was huge in size, ferocious and beautiful in shape, holding an 8 treasure crane in its mouth that kept flapping its wings, and was rushing towards a certain direction. After being stunned for a while, several people almost said in unison, Senior Ling Long. The thief turned out to be Ling Long. The several chiefs came back to their senses, looked at each other, and immediately said, let's go and have a look. Yihao first looked at the Ling Long holding the 8 treasures crane in his mouth and flew to a certain direction in a daze and speechless, and then looked at the chiefs who were leaving one after another, frowning slightly. He looked at the chief of Daofeng and the chief of Chunyang Peak, and then followed silently. I originally wanted to find an opportunity to slowly contact Musian in the future and cultivate feelings. After all, only the 4 main peaks knew about the Ling Long before. But now, I'm afraid it can't be hidden. When Musian returned to Tianhe Garden, he happened to see the Ling Long in the air throwing the 8 treasures crane in its mouth to the ground, and then fell gracefully, turning into a slender figure. Musian was stunned for a long time, then he looked up at Lin Ling helplessly and said, Senior Ling Long, are you stealing again? I mean, did you go to Senior Yihao to borrow an 8 treasures crane again? Lin Ling nodded slightly, pointed at the immobile 8 treasures crane on the ground, and glanced at Musian again, her mouth slightly opened. If Yihao knew about it, I'm afraid the psychological shadow area would get bigger again. Musian looked at the 8 treasures crane on the ground, nodded slightly and said, well, I understand, I'll go prepare a midnight snack for you now. Lin Ling nodded with satisfaction and walked into the house with light steps. At the same time, in the air, except for Yihao and the other 4 who were present at Tianhe Garden that day, the other 5 people were all a little confused, puzzled. Ling Long lived in the glazed palace. And he also caught an 8 treasures crane and took it back to feed a disciple of a section? If I remember correctly, Tianhe Garden is where the inner disciple that junior sister Yan just accepted lives, right? The extremely beautiful head of Tianji Peak stared at Tianhe Garden in doubt and whispered, Senior Ling Long lives in a disciple's villa. I remember that a disciple in the sect went to a villa in Liyulai Palace to make trouble, questioning another disciple for hiding a demon cultivator, but the matter was later left unresolved. Ning Yuan frowned and said, could it be that demon is Senior Ling Long? Several heads stood in the cold wind, looking at the silver-haired beauty who returned to the house, and were speechless for a long time. They suddenly understood why Yan Ruyu made this choice. After an unknown amount of time, several heads came back to their senses and looked at the young man who was packing the 8 treasure crane, with a little more appreciation in their eyes. Yan Ruyu glanced at the heads one by one meaningfully, and then stayed on 2 of the women with curvy figures for a moment. She withdrew her gaze without leaving a trace. The true value of Musian is not just the spirit dragon behind him. She pursed her lips and stared at Musian's back. His own existence itself is a huge value. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 138. Late at night, outside the glazed palace, an old man stood with his hands behind his back, looking calm. A young man with sharp eyebrows and bright eyes followed him, looking a little unhappy, obviously remembering the scene he had just seen not long ago. A young master from a family in Tianqian City actually dared to go to the young lady at such a late hour? And the young lady actually let him in. Recalling the young lady's softened tone when she mentioned Musian, Zhou Kang's face became more and more ugly. He looked up at the old man beside him and said, "Mr. Shen, is it really okay to let the young lady contact other people of the same age, and at such a late hour?" Mr. Shen stood with his hands behind his back and smiled lightly. "You are not unaware of the young lady's temper. If we continue to stay there, do you really think she won't get angry? Although Ye Lingxian always looks elegant and smiling, she is the saint of the restricted area after all. Even if she is gentle on weekdays, she is arrogant in her bones. If you disobey her words without authorization, no one can bear the consequences. Even so, you shouldn't let the young lady contact a person of the opposite sex so late at night." Zhou Kang said coldly. Old Shen shook his head and said with a smile, "The young lady knows her own limits. No matter what happens, we can't disobey her wishes." He paused and continued, "If you are really worried, you can go and see what the eldest young master of the Mu family means to the young lady." "The Musian just went back," Old Shen spoke again. Zhou Kang raised his head and looked at the old man with a little surprise, and said, "What does Old Shen mean? We should go find that Musian now." Old Shen nodded slightly and smiled, "Go find him, but remember not to do it in the section." They were able to enter the Lianji sect with the tacit approval of the upper echelons, but this does not mean that they can do whatever they want. Letting them in was just to give face to the restricted area behind, but if they attacked the disciples in the sect, the meaning would be different. Zhou Kang naturally understood this truth, and immediately nodded and said, "Okay. Then I'll trouble Elder Shen. It doesn't matter if we can't attack him. Just the restricted area behind Ye Lingxian, ordinary people would probably retreat just by hearing about it, let alone a mere cultivator of the 6th level of Qi training. This spirit dragon is a spirit dragon, it's really willful." Musian sat down on the ground in the courtyard, looking at the fire that was emitting sparks from time to time, and the tender crane meat roasted on the fire, and couldn't help but sigh to himself. If a normal person was known by Yi Hao to have stolen the 8 treasure crane, he would probably be beaten badly. Even if other chiefs did this, I'm afraid Yi Hao would fight with the other party. After all, he had raised this 8 treasure crane for so long, and spent countless natural materials and treasures, but in just a short time, 3 of them had been eaten. I feel angry even if I put myself in his shoes. However, Yi Hao is facing Ling Long. Even if he feels bitter, he can only swallow it. But of course, this kind of thing has nothing to do with him. Suddenly, there was a slight sound of footsteps beside him. Musian turned his head slightly and looked at the maid in the yellow skirt not far away. His eyes stayed on the exquisite and curvy maid for a moment, and smiled, "Sister Mengru, why are you still wandering outside so late? Are you worried about my safety?" Wei Mengru couldn't help but look at her young master twice more, with a hint of surprise in her eyes. Although she didn't deliberately hide her breath, she could also hide her breath passively. In the past, even if she walked behind Musian, he might not be able to detect it. As a result, she was noticed just as she approached. It seems that this young master is still meditating and practicing seriously in private. Wei Mengru looked at Musian calmly and said, "Where did you go tonight?" Musian reached out and grabbed the roasted crane meat, tore off some and tasted it. After confirming that it was almost roasted, he slowly put it on the plate. After doing all this, he turned his head to look at Wei Mengru and smiled, "Sister Mengru, why do you suddenly ask this? Are you very concerned about my affairs? Did you go to Ye Lingxian?" Wei Mengru continued to ask. Musian glanced around, shook his head slightly, and said seriously, Don't talk nonsense, I already have Ruoxi, how can I go to find another girl in the middle of the night? Wei Mengru glanced at him sideways and said coldly, don't worry, Bai Ruoxi is meditating in the room now. Musian nodded slightly, well, I just went to find Sister Lingxian because I miss her a little. Wei Mengru. She was silent for a moment and said, someone just came into Tianhe Garden, it seems to be someone from Lingxian. As a cultivator in the refining spirit realm, especially a 6th grade refining spirit realm, Wei Mengru naturally noticed any disturbance in this villa. She knew this young master inside and out, and naturally knew about Lingxuan's affairs, and roughly knew what kind of powerful forces were behind her. It seems that it should be the two servants who originally came to ask Sister Lingxian to go back, Musian said suddenly. It's better to be careful. One of the two has stepped into the return to void realm half a step, and the other is also a genius of the 9th grade of Qi refining, Wei Mengru reminded. Since the other party sneaked into Tianhe Garden without saying a word, it is clear that they are not here to do anything good, at least, it is not a good thing for them. Have they come in? Musian asked. Wei Mengru nodded silently. Isn't that great? Musian smiled, since the visitors are guests, since they have come, we must also entertain them well. Is this Tianhe Garden? The Tuyi Sex Cave Heaven skills are really surprising. Mr. Shen took the young people around him into Tianhe Garden, looked at this villa, and couldn't help but admire it. The art of the cave, this is where every monk who reaches the realm of returning to the void can create a cave. Although he returned to the void in half a step, he could still create a cave. But a cave like the Lianji sect cannot be achieved by just relying on the return to the void realm. It also requires some secret techniques and superb spiritual energy control methods. Only a behemoth like the Lianji sect could create such a perfect cave. Zhou Kang, who was following Mr. Shen, did not speak, but just looked at the layout of the surrounding environment, seemingly absent-mindedly. When he originally set out from the restricted area to Liangyi sect, he thought about putting some pressure on Yeyu. When the results came, he found that the situation was not what he thought. The person the young lady likes is not Yeyu, but a name she has never heard of before. When they were in the study just now, they also saw Musian. How on earth did a monk with a 6th level of Qi training attract the young lady? Not only Zhou Kang, but also Mr. Shen didn't understand. The two of them strolled into Tianhe Garden. Mr. Ren put his hands behind his back and said with a slight smile, this Musian's talent is actually quite good, but it may have been neglected for a period of time in the past, otherwise it would be useless. He's a young genius. A monk who has returned to the void realm can tell a person's talent at a glance, and Musian's talent was something that this old man could clearly see at a glance not long ago. Zhou Kang disagreed and said, so what if he is a genius? There are many geniuses in our clan, and who is worse than Musian? He paused and shook his head slightly, no. I think most people's talents should be much stronger than him. He was always a little dissatisfied. When he was in the restricted area in the past, many young disciples in the clan secretly admired Lingxian, but no one had successfully captured the beauty's heart. As a result, after coming to the Lianji sect this time, I actually saw this young lady falling in love with someone. If the people in the clan knew about this, I am afraid that the mentality of most of the younger generation would explode. Mr. Shen nodded slightly and said with a smile, that's true. Throughout the ages, there have been so many geniuses, but none of them can truly reach the Hedeo realm. The so-called geniuses are just born every few years in the world of immortality. Just an ordinary monk. Mr. Shen continued, however, the young lady probably doesn't like Musian's talent. He has been there, so he naturally understands what these male-female love affairs are all about. To pursue a girl, you don't need any natural ability. What you need is emotional intelligence and the ability to adapt to circumstances and know how to make a girl happy. This Musian, presumably, has such ability. However, even if he could win Ye Lingxuan's favor based on these alone, he would not be recognized by the disciples in the restricted area or even the clan elders in the future. Not to mention that Musian is at the 6th level of Qi training, it is useless even if he is at the God refining level now. After all, for existences like them, what they value more is the power behind the other party. The reason why some geniuses fall is more often because of enemies. Without the protection of the forces behind him, there is no guarantee that some enemies will strangle him in the cradle if he travels in these 9 states in the future. At this time, Mr. Shen suddenly noticed that there seemed to be a gaze staring silently at the shadow in a corner. He turned his head and looked slightly, with a bit of surprise in his eyes, and said with a slight smile, "6th level of God refining, his talent is really good." Even within Kyushu, the number of people who can reach the 6th level of Shenlian at this age can be counted on one hand. With Wei Mengru's talent, it's no wonder that this old man from the penalty area was so surprised. Zhou Kang followed Mr. Shen's gaze, but could not see Wei Mengru's figure, and could only vaguely feel her presence. What is the identity of Musian, that he lives in a separate garden with a disciple of the 6th level of Shenlian? Soon, Zhou Kang noticed something again, and his eyes fell directly on a candle-lit room not far away. "Does anyone else live here?" Mr. Shen's eyes narrowed slightly and he said in surprise, "2nd-grade God refining." Even this old man who had no feeling for genius was a little surprised at this moment. "Where is Musian?" Zhou Kang suddenly said to himself. From the time they walked into Tianhe Garden until now, they seemed to have not seen Musian. He must have just come back. Mr. Shen didn't say anything, but just walked towards the backyard. He could feel the aura of a certain monk in the backyard. When I stepped into the backyard, I saw a room lit by candlelight as expected. And in that room, he felt Musian's aura. At this time, the door of the room quietly opened, and a handsome young man walked out of the room. Seeing the two of them, Musian's eyes immediately showed a trace of panic. He hurriedly closed the door, then looked at the two of them and said, "Who are you?" Mr. Shen said with a smile, "Young lady, you don't have to be so nervous. I am a servant of the young lady's family." "Who is your young lady?" Musian asked in confusion. "Ye Lingxian," Zhou Kang said indifferently. Musian was relieved when he heard this and asked, "So it's the guests from Sister Lingxian? You two are so late, what's the matter with my Tianhe garden?" Old Shen shook his head and smiled, "It's nothing big, I just heard that young friend Mu is very close to my young lady, so I came to see before leaving." At this point, he paused and continued, "Young friend Mu, since you have so many girls around you, I still hope to keep a little distance from my young lady in the future. This is also for your own good. The maid just now, and even the girl in another room, these people live in a separate garden. He doesn't believe that they have no close relationship." And seeing that Musian was so panicked when he saw them just now, it is obvious that there is also a girl living in this room. As for why he was so panicked, it is probably because just now. "I don't understand what you two mean, can you explain it in a simpler and clearer way?" Musian asked puzzledly. Zhou Kang stared at Musian and smiled faintly, "Stay away from my young lady in the future, do you understand?" He thought it might take some effort to get Musian to stay away from Ye Lingxian, but he didn't expect that he would find out that this boy was living with other girls as soon as he entered the villa. If the young lady knew about this, they wouldn't need to do anything at all, the young lady would know what to do. Musian frowned slightly when he heard this and said, "Lingxian is just my sister, you two have misunderstood." Zhou Kang raised his head and stared at Musian, sneering, "Master Mu means that I can ask the young lady to come and see what kind of romantic person you are." When he said this, his eyes fell directly on the closed door in front of him. Musian's face changed slightly, and he subconsciously blocked the door and said, "You two, you can insult me, but you can't insult the people in this room. She and I are not that kind of relationship." "In that case, dare you open the door for us to see?" Zhou Kang smiled, seeing through Musian's panic at a glance. Elder Shen raised his head slightly and looked at the door behind Musian, but there was a trace of doubt between his old eyebrows. Just after entering Tianhe Garden, he noticed two cultivators in Tianhe Garden, one of whom was a 6th grade cultivator and the other was a 2nd grade cultivator. But he could not sense any breath from the cultivator in this room. There are only two possibilities. One is that the other party is an ordinary person. The other is that the cultivator here is at a higher level than him and hides his own breath. In Lianji sect, apart from the sect master, the only ones who are higher than him seem to be the chiefs and elders. He also knows a few elders of Zhifeng, and this breath does not belong to any of the chiefs. After all, if it is an elder, he should not live with a disciple. It is impossible that Musian has even chased a certain female elder, right? Friend Mu, who lives here? Elder Shen asked. Musian said respectfully, in reply to the senior, the girl living here is a girl I just picked up not long ago. The girl I picked up? Master Mu, don't you know that Lianji sect prohibits people other than sect disciples from living here? Zhou Kang said with a somewhat sarcastic tone. If this is known to others, you will probably be punished. Musian's face changed slightly, but he tried to keep his composure and said, the girl is actually a member of the sect, not an outsider as you two said. Seeing this, Zhou Kang smiled and said, in this case, Master Mu, can you open the door for us to see? This is not good, she doesn't like to be disturbed by outsiders. Musian frowned. Old Shen smiled lightly, young friend Mu, don't worry, I'm just taking a look, I won't tell the section. At most, I will explain this to the young lady. 3 opposite sexes live in a villa, the young lady is not a fool, as long as she listens, she should understand what kind of person this Musian is. Musian was a little embarrassed when he heard this, and said, but her image is not very good now. Don't worry, my friend. I just want to see how talented she is. I have a good relationship with several elders of the section. If she has good talent, I can recommend her to them and accept her as a disciple of the section, Old Shen said with a smile. He raised his fingertips inadvertently, releasing a ray of silver-white light. The next moment, the light turned into 1,000 paper cranes and flew to the mansion where Ye Lingxian lived. Take this opportunity to call the young lady to come and see. Musian was silent for a long time, and finally gritted his teeth, stepped aside, and said, okay, please, senior. When he said this, he lowered his eyes slightly, making it difficult to see what kind of emotions he contained in his eyes. Old Shen smiled slightly, quietly stepped forward and opened the door. Looking closely, he only saw a silver-haired beauty sitting on a chair, holding a roasted crane leg with a fragrant meat smell and silently chewing it. There was still some oil stain on the corner of her mouth, and her red eyes were gorgeous and clear. She ate without any image. At this moment, a silence enveloped the outside of the house. Zhou Kang was stunned. Is this what Musian said? The image is not very good. This image is really not very good. After all, she didn't consider her image when eating. But this was not the same as what he imagined. The picture he originally imagined should be. Lin Ling seemed to have noticed the movement at the door and glanced over. Boom! In an instant, it was as if a thunder exploded in the old man's mind. His pupils suddenly contracted, and countless goosebumps appeared on his body, and his scalp was numb. At the same time, the several leaders who were watching the scene coldly under the sky just now also quietly landed in front of Tianhe Garden. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 139. Under the night, 9 chiefs landed gracefully, and Musian subconsciously raised his head to take a look. Among these chiefs, he saw a few familiar faces, but there were also 2 or 3 that he had never seen before, or he had not noticed them before. Why are these people not sleeping at night and patrolling over my house? Thinking about it, Musian still clasped his fists respectfully. Junior Musian, meet the chiefs. Chief? Zhou Kang turned his head and looked. When he saw the 9 chiefs in his field of vision, his heart skipped a beat and his heartbeat accelerated uncontrollably. Even among the nobles who lived in the restricted area, he had never seen 9 chiefs gather together, and even appeared in the villa of a disciple at the same time. They didn't seem to make any noise tonight. Zhou Kang subconsciously looked at Mr. Shen on the side, but found that the old man's eyes were also filled with astonishment. But soon, he came back to his senses, bowed his hands, and said with a smile, "My dear masters, I didn't seem to make any noise tonight. How come you are so leisurely and elegant tonight?" Yuzian said with a smile, "This friend Mu is the inner disciple accepted by my junior sister. Since he is my junior sister's disciple, he is also my disciple. Tonight, I saw someone breaking into my disciple's villa late at night, so I came to take a look." Yuzian suddenly changed her tone and said, "I wonder what you two want to see my disciple late at night." As soon as these words came out, the eyes of several masters present at Daofeng's master looked a little strange. Daofeng used to make this pair of sisters never contact each other because of the dispute over the mastership. As a result, this Daofeng master just said a few words and forced Musian to accept him as an inner disciple. This should be done for Linglong to see. Several masters understood it in their hearts, but they didn't think too much about it. After all, isn't the greatest value of Musian the spiritual dragon behind him? When the eyes of several chiefs were all filled with strangeness, Yu Suanji, the chief of Tianji Peak, narrowed his eyes slightly, and always felt a kind of indescribable weirdness in his heart. Even if there was a relationship with the spiritual dragon, the attitude shown by this chief of Daofeng was a little too enthusiastic. It was as if he was deliberately trying to gain Musian's favor. This was not like her character. On the other hand, looking at the chiefs in front of him, the old man from the restricted area was full of solemnity at this time, and felt a huge pressure in his heart. The 9 chiefs usually appeared in the main peaks, that is, they were recently holding the selection of inner disciples. If you want to see them in the future, you may only be in their respective main peaks, and if you want to meet them, you have to look at the other party's mood. But now, these 9 chiefs appeared in the villa of a disciple? If it is for a disciple, it is a bit unreasonable. But if it's not for this disciple, what else is there? At this moment, a beautiful voice like a song suddenly came from behind. A. Lin Ling held a crane leg, tilted his head and looked at everyone, with doubt in his gorgeous red eyes. "Senior Lin Ling should mean what are you doing here so late, is that what you mean?" Musian acted as an interpreter and looked at Lin Ling tentatively. AAA, Lin Ling pecked his head like a chicken, with confusion in his gorgeous red eyes, while gnawing on the tender and juicy crane meat roasted by the imperial chef. However, just such a simple gaze made the heads of several heads feel a little numb, and arose in their hearts. The head of Huabao Peak stepped forward and said with a fist, "We just noticed that there seemed to be outsiders coming in to disturb us, so we came to check the situation." He could feel that the person Linglong was staring at just now was him, and the reason was all because of the good things done by the deputy head of Huabao Peak and the third prince before. Now this Linglong should remember Huabao Peak. It's just, this memory is not a good impression. Yihao looked at the crane leg in Lin Ling's hand respectfully and strangely, and secretly glanced at the exquisite and flawless face of the silver-haired beauty, and couldn't help but twitched his mouth slightly. Even if you eat secretly, you should know to wipe it clean. However, this senior Lin Ling didn't seem to understand this truth. At this moment, he was reluctant to put down the crane leg in his hand even in front of so many people. Lin Ling slightly turned his head to look at Musian, and then wrote on the table, "Why are they all here?" Musian said helplessly, "Senior should have heard it just now." Several chiefs just noticed that outsiders entered Tianhe Garden, so they came to take a look. As for them, he glanced at Elder Shen and Zhou Kang, who was standing beside him, and sighed. I have told them that the senior doesn't like to be disturbed, but they insisted on opening the door to see the senior. The junior is of humble status and it is not easy to stop them, so. First, he put himself in the most vulnerable position, and then lightly put a big black pot on the heads of the two. This set of combined punches made the eyes of the 9 chiefs fall on Elder Shen. Mr. Shen, we turned a blind eye to your entry into Lianji sect, but it does not mean that we can let you do whatever you want. A glimmer of light flashed across Yi Hao's eyes, and he stared at Mr. Shen sharply and said, if it disturbs Senior Linglong's practice, can you bear the responsibility? Or should I say that this action is also your master's responsibility? Order. Senior Spirit Dragon? Mr. Shen obviously hadn't reacted yet, but after a brief blank moment, his brain suddenly seemed to think of something. When he raised his head to look at the spirit dragon again, a turmoil arose in his heart, and he lost his voice. Spirit dragon? Is this silver-haired woman a spiritual dragon? But how could she be in a disciple's villa? If Wei Mengru and Bairu Oxi's talent only surprised Mr. Shen, then when he heard spirit dragon, the old man's body slowly stiffened and he subconsciously took half a step back. No wonder he had an indescribable feeling of palpitations when he saw her for the first time, because this woman was even the sacred beast of the Liangyi sect. At this time, a cold snort suddenly came from the side. Yu Suanji stared at the two of them and said in a cold voice, trespassing into the disciple's residence without permission, and even disturbing Senior Linglong's Qing cultivator. I will report this matter to the owner of the restricted area. Ask for an explanation. This practice is to show the spirit dragon, and at the same time it can show the image of an elder who protects the calf, which has no harm at all. Moreover, disturbing Linglong's Qing cultivation without authorization, no matter whether it was intentional or not, this is an extremely serious matter. The same is true even if the spirit dragon is not cultivating at all, but is simply eating the newly captured 8 treasure crane. Originally, the senior officials of the Liangyi sect turned a blind eye to the two people coming from the restricted area, only seeing that behind them was the restricted area. But disturbing the spirit dragon, the meaning is completely different. You two just sneaked into the Liangyi sect before, but you made such a big fuss in the villa of a disciple of the section. Do you really think that there is no one in our sect? My inner disciple is also meditating in this private garden tonight. What will she think if she sees an outsider coming in to disturb her after her meditation? As each leader spoke up, Musian looked at the leaders standing on his side, his eyes softened, and he felt warm in his heart. As expected, the elders of the sect are all good people, the men are kind and gentle, and the female elders and the head girl are both good-looking and well-spoken. It's great. It's just that the look in Dao Feng's leader's eyes doesn't feel right. It doesn't look like the way an elder looks at a junior. Yu Suanji glanced at Musian casually, and then his eyes rested on Ziyan for a moment, and he couldn't help but narrowed his eyes slightly. The way the leader of the Dao Feng looked at Musian seemed to show more than just love for his disciples. Yuzian is so kind to Musian, presumably because of Linglong. So here comes the question. For what reason did Musian attract Senior Linglong? The leader of Tianji Peak stared silently at Musian, with a hint of depth in his charming eyes. You're deceiving us. At this time, Zhou Kang, who had been silent all this time, suddenly raised his head and stared at Musian, saying coldly, Musian, since you have been living in Tianhe Garden, how could you not know that the person living here is a spirit dragon? Musian frowned slightly and sighed softly, you too, I didn't say anything to you for trespassing into Tianhe Garden. I just saw that you were sent by Lingxuan's family. I have a good temper, but that doesn't mean you can't let others bully you. What you just said was clearly a trap on purpose, Zhou Kang reprimanded angrily. Musian asked back, when you just asked me to get out of the way and said you wanted me to open the door behind me, did I try to stop you in every possible way? Did I tell you that she is also from the sect? Musian asked again. Zhou Kang opened his mouth, but for a moment he didn't know how to refute. Musian was indeed right at the time, but at that time, they only thought that Musian was a romantic person, and subconsciously thought that he had just been intimate with the owner of the room, so they asked to open the door words. But even if he had 100 courages, Zhou Kang would not dare to say these words. Is it possible to say now, I just suspect that you are having an affair with the owner of this house, and I propose to open the door for the sake of my lady's guess? Even a fool knows that this should not be said carelessly. Having an intimate relationship with the silver-haired beauty, the Zhenzong Ruishuo of the Lianji section. If these words come out, it may be completely impossible to end the situation. You said at that time that the image of the people in the room was not good looking. Didn't you try to induce us to disturb Senior Ling Long? Zhou Kang said suddenly. These words directly dragged Musian into the water. It was Musian who first said that Ling Long's current image was not very good looking, and then they raised questions. Even if they disturbed Ling Long's cultivation, what about Musian who spoke ill of Ling Long behind his back? Unexpectedly, after Musian was stunned for a moment, he glanced at the silver-haired beauty beside him and said, Senior Lin Ling looks very good looking now. As soon as these words came out, the room fell completely silent. Even if Lin Ling's current image is not good looking, no one dares to say it directly, but Musian said so directly. If the spirit dragon is unhappy because of this. Several people looked at Lin Ling subconsciously. The silver-haired beauty is wearing a simple robe, her silver hair is loose, her eyebrows are picturesque, and her red eyes are shining with hope. He was holding a crane leg in his hand, and under his robe, he was wearing small short boots, swaying gently as if there was no one else around. After eating the crane leg, she licked her fingers, then picked up a small piece of crane meat with her fingers and put it into her mouth. Then, she glanced at the big meat buns on the table with her starry eyes, happily grabbed two, and ate them with a grunt sound, her cheeks bulging. After swallowing hard, she took a sip of the tea on the table, and then picked up the crane meat that Musian had just roasted. Everyone fell silent. Lin Ling's style was obviously a little different from theirs. Yi Hao took his eyes off first, looked at the two of them indifferently, and said, I will personally ask the master of the restricted area about what happened to you two today to see if it was his intention to disturb the spiritual dragon's cultivation. Zhou Kang's body stiffened slightly, and he opened his mouth slightly several times, but swallowed his words again. If the Lord of the Forbidden Zone knew that they had made such a big fuss in the Lianji sect, they would probably be punished. Moreover, some people in the clan would probably gossip about them behind their backs. Elder Shen looked at Musian deeply and remained silent. There are several chiefs supporting Musian, and there is a spirit dragon living here. It seems that he is too superficial. With a spirit dragon by his side, he is destined to be mediocre in this life. The blessings she gives can benefit the cultivators for a lifetime. It is not surprising that these chiefs would stand here with Musian today. If the occasion was not wrong, he would also support Musian. As for the reason, it is actually very simple. The spirit dragon can represent everything. Why is it so lively here? At this time, a clear and pleasant voice came from a distance, breaking the serious atmosphere. Musian looked up and saw a girl in a purple dress walking towards him. She looked around with a smile. When she saw Lin Ling and Zhou Kang in the room, she immediately understood something. Ye Lingxian first nodded slightly to the heads of several elders, then her eyes fell on Elder Shen, and her voice was calm, What are you doing here? Zhou Kang opened his mouth slightly and said, Miss. I will write a letter to my father to explain this matter later, Ye Lingxian said lightly. After that, she turned her head to look at Musian, with a little apology in her eyes, and said softly, I'm sorry to have caused you so much trouble. Musian just shook his head and smiled, and then bowed to the heads of the elders and said, "I'm sorry to have caused trouble to you all tonight. It's getting late. I think it's better to leave here first and don't disturb Senior Lin Ling." Hearing this, several people nodded slightly and agreed with Musian's words. After everyone left Lin Ling's room, Musian glanced at Lin Ling, who was still chewing a meat bun silently, and quietly closed the door. Yi Hao glanced at Mr. Shen and the talented young man beside him, and said, "Please go back, don't continue to disturb the practice of the sect disciples." Mr. Shen subconsciously glanced at Ye Lingxian, no longer as calm as he was at the beginning, and just hesitated, "Miss." Ye Lingxian frowned slightly and said lightly, "I will go back by myself in half a year." After that, she ignored the two and watched them being invited out of Lianji sect by several chiefs. Next, several chiefs stayed in Tianhe Garden and chatted for a few words, but everyone looked at Musian with a little more appreciation that they had never had before, with a regretful look of "it's a pity not to accept this boy as a disciple of our peak." If they had known that Ling Long lived in Tianhe Garden, they would have found a way to recruit Musian into their main peak. This junior sister Yan is really sharp. She actually recruited Musian as an inner disciple in advance. Several chiefs who didn't know Ling Long lived here before all sighed in their hearts, but because it was late at night, they couldn't stay any longer, so they got up and said goodbye. In front of the courtyard, the moonlight was hazy. Ye Lingxian looked up at the chiefs who had left, turned her head to look at Musian, and smiled lightly, "Master seems to like you very much." Before leaving, the chief of Daofeng said some words of encouragement to Musian, and his eyes were full of praise. Although he had not been with Yuzian for a long time, Ye Lingxian also knew the character of this master. Normal geniuses can't catch Yuzian's eyes. But she cares so much about Musian, which can explain everything. Seeing this neighbor brother appreciated by her master, she was much happier than being praised by her master. Musian smiled slightly, "Maybe it's because I'm gifted, so Senior Yu has a love for talent." "How can you praise yourself?" Ye Lingxian gave Musian a look. Then, she sighed and said, "I'm really sorry, I didn't expect them to come to you again." It's easy to know what Shen Lao and Zhou Kang wanted to do by coming to Musian tonight. I think they want Musian to give up. Ye Lingxian raised her head and looked at Musian, and whispered, "Did they ask you to stay away from me in the future?" Musian shook his head and said, "They threatened me that I must marry Sister Lingxian in the future, otherwise they will settle accounts with me." Ye Lingxian rolled her eyes at Musian and snorted, "I know they can't say that." Musian smiled and looked at the beautiful woman bathed in the moonlight. He put his hand on the back of Ye Lingxuan's hand and said softly, "It's getting late. I'll take you home. Look at how frozen your hands are." The voice was full of tenderness. Ye Lingxian frowned slightly and glanced at Musian. She always felt that Musian seemed to want her to leave here quickly. Facts have proved that Ye Lingxuan's intuition is right. Ye Lingxuan's visit to Tianhe Garden tonight was not in Musian's plan. He didn't expect that the old man was so bad that he secretly called Ye Lingxian to Tianhe Garden. Although the girls all knew about Musian's image as a scumbag, it was something that everyone knew in their hearts. If it was put on the surface, the meaning would be completely different. "Let's go." Musian took Ye Lingxuan's hand and was about to take the girl away from Tianhe Garden. At this time, there was a slight creaking sound from the door, and a door not far from the courtyard opened quietly. Bairuoxi, wearing a white lingerie that outlined her exquisite and curvy figure, stood at the door of the room. She was tall, with long black hair flowing like a waterfall, and her eyes were fixed on Musian in front of the courtyard. "Mu Lang, why was there so much noise outside just now?" After taking a look at Musian, Miss Bai's eyes inadvertently fell on Ye Lingxian. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 140. As Bairuoxi's voice fell, he noticed the gentle gaze behind him again. Musian sighed helplessly and turned his head to look over. Miss Bai with a small breast size came into view. She was wearing a loose white single dress for home, and her hair was naturally scattered, setting off her beautiful face. Although her clothes and dress were very casual, Bai Ruoxi's appearance still easily controlled such a casual dress. Sure enough, the movement was too big. Musian noticed Bai Ruoxi's gentle eyes, but he clearly felt that Bai Ruoxi's eyes seemed to contain some different meanings than usual. Bai Ruoxi looked at Ye Lingxian with eyes full of smiles, and said, "Sister Lingxian, why did you come here so late today without informing me so that I could entertain you?" Ye Lingxian stood beside Musian. The girl wore a beautiful dress with purple as the base and hydrangeas, and a hairpin that was quite pure and lovely. She was far from Miss Bai's tall chest, but the buds were also beautiful. She looked at Miss Bai standing in front of the courtyard and smiled, "My servants have caused a lot of trouble to Brother Mu tonight. I'm here to ask them to leave." When she said this, she turned her head to look at Musian beside her and smiled slightly, "Brother Mu, I'll go back first." Although she had a moving smile on her face, the look in her eyes when she looked at Musian seemed to be a bit deep. So it is not easy for several girls to live in one place. The place is too small and it is easy to overturn if you are not careful. Musian sighed secretly, maintaining his usual gentle smile, and said, "Shall I take you home?" "Don't bother Mr. Mu. If you take me home, Sister Bai will be angry, right?" At the end, she glanced at Musian inadvertently. Seeing that he did not come up to keep her, a trace of loss flashed across the girl's eyes, and she turned and left Tian Heiwen. Musian did not chase him, but turned to the front of the courtyard. Noticing Bai Ruoxi's gentle gaze on him, he looked up and smiled, "Why are you still out so late?" Bai Ruoxi's eyes revealed a hint of resentment, "If you don't come out, how can you see what Mu Lang did outside tonight?" Musian smiled bitterly and said, "Ruoxi, you seem to have some misunderstanding about me." "Didn't Mu Lang just hold Sister Lingxuan's hand?" Bai Ruoxi asked with a smile. Under the moonlight, her snow-white skin was stained with a faint silver glow, so beautiful that it made people feel unreal. Musian sighed softly, "Tonight, the tribe behind Sister Lingxian came to look for her, and then the two tribesmen came to Tian Heiwen to make a big fuss. Didn't you know about such a big commotion?" Bai Ruoxi heard this, and the water light flashed in her peach blossom eyes, and she said softly, "Sister Lingxuan's tribesmen came? You are not injured, right?" Musian shook his head and said, "Thanks to Senior Linglong and the other leaders, I am fine." "But Sister Lingxian?" He paused, shook his head and sighed softly, "Forget it, let's not talk about her." "Who knows?" Bai Ruoxi's curiosity was aroused, raised his head and gazed at her gently. Musian said, "Did Sister Lingxuan's clansmen tell her something?" Musian sat on a bench nearby, and then took Bai Ruoxi's hand and asked her to sit beside him, feeling the beautiful touch of the beauty in his arms, and sighed, "Her clansmen asked her to return to her family immediately. I left Tianhe Garden tonight because of this." Bai Ruoxi looked at Musian tenderly, "Has Malang gone to find Sister Lingxian tonight?" Musian put one hand on Bai Ruoxi's slender hand, as if to feel the beautiful touch of her little hand, but also to prevent her from taking out the love lock. "I saw that Sister Lingxian didn't want to leave, so she wanted to communicate with her tribesmen, but who would have thought that there would be some conflicts?" Bai Ruoxi had a blank expression. After all, didn't Mu Lang go there because he was worried about her? Musian said helplessly, "Yes, I am indeed worried about Lingxian. But I am by your side now, right?" Bai Ruoxi was stunned, and his eyebrows softened a little, and his pupils, which seemed to have a little more darkness, regained their luster. Yes, he was worried about Ye Lingxian, but in the end he still stayed by her side. When she thought of this, a hint of apology appeared in her eyes. Seeing this, Musian hugged Bai Ruoxi, who was wearing a thin figure but sexy and charming, and said, "Don't think too much, this is my choice, Ruoxi." Bairuoxi's body trembled slightly, but she did not push him away, but just leaned quietly beside him, looking up at the moonlight. After a while, Bairuoxi suddenly said, "Will Mulang blame me for being too overbearing and not letting you get close to other girls? This is just a girl's most basic possessiveness, it's normal." Musian shook his head and smiled. Bairuoxi seemed to be relieved a little after hearing this. Now it seems that Ruoxi usually looks gentle and considerate, but in fact, like her senior sister, she is a very overbearing person inside. Musian didn't say anything, and sat with her in the yard silently to appreciate the moonlight. After calculating the time in his mind, Musian felt that it should be about time, so he let go of Bairuoxi's hand and said, "Senior Linglong just ate a treasure crane today, I'll go help her clean up the dishes." Miss Bai glanced at Musian dimly, and then said softly. After sending Bairuoxi back to her room to rest, Musian left the room slowly, closed the door for Bairuoxi, raised her hand and stretched her waist. Then, she came to the courtyard slowly and suddenly said, "Sister Mengru, did you see where Sister Lingxian went?" Wei Mengru's figure quietly appeared in the field of vision, holding her proud chest with both hands, leaning against the stone pillar, and said lightly, "She didn't go back, and seemed to go to the direction of the pilgrimage temple." "Why go to the pilgrimage temple so late?" Musian thought for a moment, and immediately went to Linglong's room. The silver-haired beauty who was sitting in the room eating a big meat bun turned her head and looked over, blinking her red eyes, with a hint of doubt in her eyes, and tilted her head. "Senior Lin Ling, I want to trouble you for something." Under Linglong's gaze, Musian said something. After finishing everything, Musian left Linglong's room and was about to go to the pilgrimage hall when Wei Mengru's cold voice suddenly came from behind him. "Are you not afraid that Bairuoxi will not be able to find anyone when she comes out later if you go now?" Musian glanced at her and smiled. She already knows now. Most girls are soft-hearted creatures. At that time, Musian's words about Ye Lingxian made Miss Bai soft-hearted, and Musian's top priority was Bairuoxi, which gave her enough sense of security. Although she was still jealous, Bairuoxi chose to let Musian leave Tianhewen this time. If you have to say, this time is not a bad thing, at least Bairuoxi has tacitly accepted the existence of Ye Lingxian and will not resist as much as at the beginning. One step closer to harmonious and friendly coexistence. Ye Lingxian was in the Qi training stage, and walking alone was definitely not as fast as flying on a sword. Therefore, after 10 minutes, Musian saw Ye Lingxuan's slender purple figure on a golden suspension bridge in front of the pilgrimage hall. She walked quickly on the way to the pilgrimage hall, her shoulders trembling slightly. Seeing this, Musian immediately shouted, "Sister Lingxian, wait." Ye Lingxian heard the familiar voice, but ignored it at all, and walked faster and faster. But Musian quickly caught up with her with his flying sword and blocked Ye Lingxian. Ye Lingxian looked up at him and said lightly, "Do you have anything else to do, Master Mu?" Is she throwing a tantrum? Why does it feel different from the image of the elegant lady in my impression? But it is true, after all, she is just a girl who has not experienced much of the world. It is normal for her to be so angry. Musian understood in his heart, and said, "Why did you come to the pilgrimage temple alone? Didn't we agree to go out to appreciate the flowers together tomorrow?" Ye Lingxian said lightly, "I won't go tomorrow, Mr. Mu, please go back, so that Miss Bai won't worry." At the end, she turned her face away silently, leaving only a pure and delicate profile to Musian. "Ruoxi already knows that I'm out," Musian said. Ye Lingxian heard this, looked at Musian deeply, and said softly, "I don't need Miss Bai's pity. This girl who has been pampered since childhood, although she treats people peacefully, is still somewhat arrogant in her bones. Naturally, she will resist Bairuoxi's charity." Musian didn't say anything, but just reached out to grab Ye Lingxuan's hand. But the girl immediately stepped back and whispered, "Mr. Mu, please respect yourself." Muzian said softly, let's go back. Yelingxian turned her face away and said coldly, where to go? You go back to your Miss Bai, who should I go to? When she said this, she felt inexplicably sad. After going back, she would rest alone in the house, while Muzian would accompany Miss Bai in Tianhe Garden, maybe even practice dual cultivation with her. I will go back with you, Muzian said. Mr. Mu, please go back. I don't plan to go back yet, Yelingxian said lightly. Where are you going? Muzian asked. To see the peach blossoms. What about tomorrow? Yelingxian hummed, I won't go tomorrow. It sounds a bit arrogant. Muzian was silent. Yelingxian no longer paid attention to Muzian and walked towards the direction of the Temple of the Holy Spirit. Her steps were not fast, but with every step she took, she felt the breath behind her gradually fade away, until finally, she noticed Muzian's figure flying away on a sword, and she couldn't help but lower her eyes slightly, her eyes full of disappointment. Girls are such tangled creatures. When they are angry, no matter how you talk to them, it's useless. They insist on driving people away. As a result, after they really do it, they get even angrier. Muzian was naturally not stupid enough to really obey and go back to Tianhe Garden. Instead, he took the lead in going to the pilgrimage hall, and then took out several palm-sized stone tablets and placed them next to the nearby peach tree. He raised his hand and pinched his fingers, and the dark stone tablets all quietly enlarged. After doing all this, Muzian looked up at the bright moonlight, while silently thinking about the journey Yelingxian had come. When a girl is angry, persuasion alone may not be useful, but after she calms down, doing something happy, that will be very useful. Not only is it useful, but the effect is doubled. As night falls, the crescent moon hangs high. Before she knew it, Yelingxian arrived at the pilgrimage temple. Because it was late, the visibility was extremely low, and there was no one in the pilgrimage hall. The huge square seemed extremely lonely. Yelingxian found a stone chair near the square and sat down. She propped her chin in the dark, quietly looking at the night, thinking about everything tonight, and feeling anxious. Suddenly, it seemed as if a ray of light fell on her eyes. Yelingxian subconsciously raised her head and looked, but she suddenly found that the pilgrimage hall, which was just pitch black, was quietly shrouded by a soft pink light. When the night wind blew, the pink petals swayed gently. Yelingxian suddenly raised her head as if she had sensed something, but saw Muzian coming from the depths of the hall and looking at her. Yelingxian looked at the peach forest emitting pink light everywhere, feeling like a dream, and whispered, "What did you do?" Muzian just looked up at the night sky and sighed, "It's a pity that I can't see the starry sky tonight, otherwise it would be more beautiful." He walked to Yelingxian and sat down. Under the pink light, Yelingxian's face was as soft as jade, and her pair of pure and lovely faces in the past also had a little more charm because of such pink light. She looked at the peach blossoms swaying in the night wind with blurred eyes, and Muzian just sat beside her, looking at the snow-white and flawless profile. Girls like this usually have a calm temperament, but the charm revealed in this slightly drunk state is most likely to attract men's love. "Aren't you going back?" After a long silence, Yelingxian suddenly whispered. "How can I go back by myself when you are here?" Muzian smiled. Yelingxian glanced at Muzian inadvertently, and soon, her eyes fell on the peach forest involuntarily. After an unknown amount of time, she suddenly said with emotion, "It's so beautiful." Muzian looked at Yelingxian's snow-white jawline, curled eyelashes, and her smart eyes and elastic lips, and couldn't help but say from the bottom of his heart, "Yes, it's so beautiful." However, the beauty she was talking about was the peach blossoms, while Muzian was talking about her. Yelingxian suddenly felt a warm palm on the back of her hand, and then quietly held her hand tightly. But this time, she didn't resist at all, and let him hold her like this, staring at the blooming peach forest and the pink light that made the peach blossoms look particularly pink. When she just left Tianhewan, she swore that she would never talk to Musian again. But now, looking at everything in front of her and the warmth brought by the young man beside her, Ye Lingxian felt as if something was gently touching her heart. She tilted her head and looked at Musian's handsome face in a daze, and didn't speak for a long time. "I'm sorry, Jian'er,"